Knights of Soul Society by Illuviar. 1. Chapter 1, Awakening Final Unbetrayed. Disclaimer: I don't own Bleach or Star Wars. They belong to their respective owners. I make no money from this story. Chapter 1, Awakening, =, Curses, =. It is a familiar story, the tale of Kurosaki Ichigo, a mortal with unexpected heritage, one who would have gained an inner hollow while awakening his Shinigami powers within the shattered shaft. In that reality, he would have awoken his Zanpakuto, named Zangetsu, shortly thereafter. However, that is in another time stream, another universe altogether, because Kurosaki Ichigo in this dimension is different, though no one, even himself, knows it, though the orange-haired teen at least suspects it. To quote said teen, "I'm Kurosaki Ichigo, age 15, a high school student in Karakura High. I can also see ghosts and dream of other worlds." Ever since his mother was murdered by a hollow in front of his eyes, something within Ichigo changed. Perhaps it was an unexpected side effect of his unusual heritage, or something else, unforeseen. But ever since that day, he would occasionally dream of distant stars, of impossible worlds and people, of wonders and horrors beyond belief. Yet those half-forgotten dreams would feel as real as his memories from the previous day. Until he attempts to awaken his own Shinigami powers, that would be just one amongst the many strange things surrounding Ichigo, no more important than all the rest. That is until one day everything changed, and the fate of 3 dimensions would be forever sundered. Koses Urahara's shop training area. An incorporeal being was looking at the bottom of a deep circular hole. Within it could clearly see a young orange-haired teen whose hands were tied behind his back. The youth was laying on his side, his body rocked by convulsions. The shaft channeled his painted screams, which in turn echoed around the training area. The being, which existed in a realm beyond the perceptions of humans and Shinigami alike, channeled a small amount of its power, gently brushing Ichigo's soul chain. That was the finishing touch of a plan it had conceived millennia ago. The creature that many would have called a god and would have been right was doing only what it saw as its duty. What honor demanded from it, nothing more, yet nothing less. A thug here, a push there, a gentle slice and shove. And it was done. The last loose end was handled. If it could, the being would have let out a sigh of relief. It had finally cleaned up the last piece of collateral damage from a war that lasted eons and engulfed countless dimensions and realities. It had done its duty long time ago, when it preserved the souls of the beings that became unintentional casualties of the war. Now at last it satisfied the requirements of its honor too. Perhaps the being didn't care about the consequences of its actions in this realm, or simply they too were tiny cogs in some kind of plan. After all, it had been an architect in a conflict where plans within plans had been dancing in an endless cycle of deception. "And so it begins," whispered an ancient voice. Invisible hand brushed the soul chain of one Ichigo Kurosaki, one endless moment which looked like it was forever frozen between the present and the future. For those who had the senses to feel it, it seemed that the multiverse itself stopped to take a deep breath. For a single moment, an instant between what it was and what would be, Kurosaki Ichigo was whole, complete. In that eternity which lasted forever, he became the avatar of the Force, the first Force-sensitive being in this universe. Reality froze, shattered, and rewrote itself in an instant, a mirror image of what happened to the tortured teen. The dawn of a new era was at hand. The instant passed, time resumed its normal course. Kurosaki's soul chain, which was deteriorating way too fast, faded, its last link becoming dust. The universe changed, though neither Ichigo nor any other being that existed within noticed. He was simply relieved. The pain, the agony which should have shattered his conscious mind and paved the way for his transformation into hollow, faded away. A brief reprieve of blessed oblivion followed, before he awoke. However, Ichigo found himself away from the accursed hole. Instead, he was laying on a cold metal floor. Kurosaki's first thought was, "What's the number of the train that hit me?" He stretched slowly and looked around. The sight left his jaw hanging open. Kurosaki, the substitute Soul Reaper of Karakura Town, was in an empty, cavernous room. On his left, the expanse was shrouded in darkness, making it impossible to judge how big it was. To his right, however, he saw an awe-inspiring sight. The room on that side ended with an enormous window, showing a beautiful blue sphere, which was sprinkled with green and covered with patches of white clouds. Ichigo was looking at Earth from orbit. "Took you long enough?" A gruff male voice startled Ichigo, who jumped and turned around, ready for a confrontation. Behind him was a middle-aged woman wearing midnight black armored robes. The stranger was almost 2 meters tall, with short black hair. Her piercing grey eyes were boring straight at the young Shinigami's soul. "We finally meet, my friend," said the Achani woman. Ichigo finally got out of his stupor and asked, "Where am I?" Before adding almost like an afterthought, "And who are you?" "An old and dear friend," came the answer. "As to where we are, it should be obvious. We are in your inner domain, your mindscape, at least what's left of it. I couldn't hear her name, thought Ichigo. The last words of the stranger flew just out of the range of Kurosaki's hearing, making them gibberish of maddeningly familiar sounds. "Ah, never mind. We need to have a little chat, young man." The female waved her right hand and they were standing in a balcony, overlooking a vast park. Ichigo scowled at the stranger. "What the hell?" She waved him to a nearby, comfortably-looking armchair. It was situated on the other side of a table made of bland metal, which had 2 steaming cups of tea on it. "Sit and calm down. This conversation is long overdue. You may as well make yourself comfortable." Ichigo huffed, but sat in the armchair throwing a glare at his hosts. Some things never change." The woman looked over the trees and inhaled the scent of fresh rain and greenery coming from the various plants in the park. She quite enjoyed the scent when it mixed with the gentle aroma of the tea. "Tell me, Ichigo, what do you know about the soul cutters which the Shinigami use? What are they?" The young Reaper looked a bit confused at the question. "The Zanpakuto were tools, right? Weapons which purify hollows and can perform konso in order to send spirits to Soul Society," was his expected answer. "Think," came the curt reply from the woman across the table. Flashback. Ichigo was back on a rain-soaked street, facing a sneering, tattooed Shinigami. "You don't even know the name of your Zanpakuto," growled the tattooed Shinigami in front of him. Flashback end. One of the men who took Rukia had given a name to his Zanpakuto. Or had he? Sudden thought struck the substitute Shinigami and comprehension dawned. "You are my Zanpakuto," Ichigo exclaimed. The wonder in his voice was plain to hear. "Good, I almost thought that you really had become just a loud idiot," the woman in black remarked. Ichigo scowled, an angry retort on the tip of his tongue. But before he was able to say a word, his soul cutter was in front of him. Kurosaki never saw her moving form her seat, much less placing her hand on his forehead. "It's time to remember who you are, Ichigo," the words were said in a sad tone. A moment after hearing those words, Ichigo's world exploded. Flashes of light and darkness, shattered pieces of memories long forgotten, fragments of a personality that was long gone, shards of a broken man. Who was Kurosaki Ichigo? A son, a proud brother, a friend, a high school student, a substitute Shinigami, protector. All those and many more were just facets of his being. In hindsight, it was obvious. He is the same man, always the same at the core, protector to those precious to him, a monster for those who would harm them. A hero and a villain, the 2 sides of the same coin, so simple explanation and yet complex. He was incomplete in many ways. There were shards of his very being absent, the lack of one of which eclipsed the rest. A large piece of his heart was missing, not because of a physical wound or the near transformation into hollow. No, it was something else. Someone else, more important than his friends. Someone who he had failed, the same way he failed his mother. Ichigo's thought process ground to a halt, remembering Masaki's fate. And then there was always a part of him that knew he should have been able to save his mother all those years ago. That even as a little kid, he had the power to protect her. That was the same part of his consciousness that knew he had the power to save Rukia when those 2 Shinigami came to arrest her. And the worst thing It was not a mere denial or illusion. That power has always been part of him, yet buried deep within the depths of his soul. Dormant, forgotten. When it mattered the most, he was unable to access or even remember it. Even now, when he was finally face to face with his soul cutter, it was just out of reach, taunting him. It was a whisper, a brush of cold yet warm wind passing through his bones. That caused no mere frustration. It was maddening, enraging. He should have been able to protect them. It was his purpose, right? His thoughts were interrupted by the now a comfortingly familiar voice. Ichigo, I can't bring back your memories. They were buried too deep for too long. All I could do right now is to give you only glimpses of the past. However, I can help you remember who you are. Tell me this. Who is Rukia to you? A fellow Shinigami? A friend? Or the soul cutter trailed off. It is always the same question when you two are concerned. What is she to you? The last sentence was delivered with a different tone, much softer, almost pleading. Ichigo looked lost for a moment, and then a memory which couldn't be his, yet felt more real than almost everything else he had ever experienced, struck him like an overloaded freight train. Curse S Flashback. Time unknown, location unknown. He was kneeling in a field littered with broken bodies. Twisted lumps of metal smoked where myriad of vehicles were shattered to pieces. Acrid smoke was searing his lungs, causing sporadic coughing fits. Twin suns barely broke the low cloud cover, bathing the graveyard of men and machines in ghostly haze. Thousands upon thousands of dead littered the vast valley. And for what? A hollow victory, tasting of pain and ashes. It was all for nothing. The woman he loved, his reason for existing, was dead. One moment she was there, proud and magnificent, leading platoon of troopers. In the next, a flash of artillery and not even ashes remained. Just a patch of rock turned into magma from the strike. It was inconceivable, impossible. He received no warning whatsoever through the Force. The sudden roaring void that had replaced his bond with Rukia had driven him to madness, deep into the seducing corruption of the dark side. Just like that, his world had crumbled. Jedi Master Rukia Kurosaki was dead. There were no words to describe his anguish and heart. Wrecking pain, only terrible howls of pain. He had left himself to the dark side. For once, he didn't care about the consequences of listening to her seductive whispers. Only the sour, numbing embrace of the rage which deadened his pain mattered. Like a berserker, fueled by boundless hatred, he had thrown himself against the enemy until there were none left alive. And now, as he lay dying, Ichigo Kurosaki, no, he was Darth Revan again, had a moment to think about his past. An ex-Jedi Knight, once upon a time a hero of the Republic, later a traitor and the Dark Lord of the Sith, a man who had returned to the light because of his feelings for a woman. It didn't really matter. This was his end. He was hollow inside, and somehow he knew that he wasn't going to be part of the Force once he passed on. There was something darker awaiting him. Somewhere on the edges of his perception, strange forces were moving. He was startled by a revelation. Whatever those things were, they were dead to the Force. He could barely make their outlines by the void in the energy field that the Force was. His mind was racing. In his last moments, Ichigo believed that those forces somehow blunted the precognitive abilities granted by the Force, making this tragedy possible. Swaying in delirium, he sensed his heart stopping. He was totally losing it. Ichigo thought that there was a crumbling chain attached to his chest, fading and ripping a hole where his heart used to be. Darkness enveloped him, and Revan knew no more. Flashback end, cos S. Two yellow eyes looked at the woman in black. There was a sour expression on the youth's face, morphing into his usual frown. The Zanpakuto stared back. Ichigo's eyes were no longer the innocent ones of a teenager. Well, that's unexpected. Revan looked at the female standing few paces away from him. The part of him that was the young Ichigo was literally gobsmacked from the flood of remembered memories. The Force Adept, on the other hand, was incredulous at the world in which this Kurosaki Ichigo had been born. Granted, he had been well acquainted with the phenomenon of Force ghosts, so the idea of life after the death was something he was well aware of, but this whole Shinigami hollow mess was a bit of a stretch, even for someone as open-minded as him. So any idea who's playing God so I could end up in this reality, with the apparent intention to save someone who is the splitting image of my deceased wife? Revan asked aloud. Shifting through the memories of his younger self, Revan reached the conclusion that the Rukia he knew in this time and age did not remember their previous lives, if she was the same person soul at all. On the other, had he found the interactions between her and his younger self quite amusing? He shrugged. It didn't really matter in the short term. Revan simply couldn't take the chance, because Rukia could very well be his wife's soul reincarnated, and even if she wasn't, he still owed her a debt for saving his sisters and him from that hollow. Besides, with him now apparently being substitute Shinigami, Revan just had to know more about the Soul Reaper's world and government. It was the prudent thing to do. I will save her, he declared. The substitute Shinigami looked at his Zanpakuto spirit and smirked. Once again, we have a damsel in distress to save, partner. At least this time, she isn't a brat of a Jedi who can't keep track of her lightsaber. Oh, please. It wasn't Bastia's fault, not fully at least. Let's hope that there won't be any Rakuls this time. I hate those critters, the spirit murmured. Yeah, Ichigo shuddered. Those things gave him the creeps. He hoped that by now the damned monstrosities were wiped out. He would never know what possessed the ancient Sith to create those things. Then again, on second thought, they were probably more or less unhinged. Revan closed his eyes and concentrated. For first time in eternity, he could sense the Force. It was different. It felt wild, untouched, as if no one had ever reached and tried to channel it. Yet another challenge to overcome, he thought. We still have few days. Unfortunately, there are huge blank spots in my memories as Revan. To make matters worse, now that I can finally sense the Force again, there is a raw feeling to it. I believe it will be much harder to use. Revan looked at his Zanpakuto. The spirit nodded and smirked at him. So this time might take you much longer to fully restore your connection with the Force. Further, you'll need to learn how to use Reiatsu, and all the little things that make someone a competent Shinigami. She grinned at him. Ichigo's eyes became cooler, calculating. Unless you are somehow able to restore most of my memories, especially when the use of various Force techniques are concerned, I'll have to rely a lot on whatever training Urahara manages to give me. And lots of improvisation. The last part is SOP when you are concerned, the spirit quipped. Hush you. Ichigo smiled for the first time in days. Plus whatever instinctive knowledge left from my time as hollow, if any. Ichigo scowled. That bastard Urahara threw me in the shattered shaft without telling me the possible consequences. The possibility of me becoming a hollow wasn't important enough to mention. Bloody hat and clogs. To be fair, you would have gone in anyway, stated the woman. That's not the point. Oh, I agree. You'll just have to rely on Mai to deal with him. She grinned viciously. Time to go Sith Lord on his ass. Ichigo chuckled evilly and drifted out of his mindscape. =, Urahara's shop training grounds. Urahara Kisuke was nervous. It should have taken 3 days for the kid's soul chain to deteriorate. Instead, it took a mere 10 hours. In hindsight, it was probably a good thing that the kids went for a snack half-hour ago. Tessai was unable to contain the transforming teen and now was exhausted after using most of his Reiatsu in futile attempt to bind Kurosaki's hollowificating form. So now Urahara would have to finish the job. He couldn't let the hollow which his student turned into to roam free. Kisuke shuddered at the thought what Isshin and Yoruichi would do to him when they find out about this debacle. Surviving their wrath wasn't likely. The smoke and dust caused by the failed sealing attempt were clearing enough to show a masked figure in black armored robes, which were decorated with eye-catching flowing red pattern. The mask was made of a dark metal, polished almost to the point of shining. Its lines had vague resemblance with that of the helmets of the clone troopers in the new Star Wars movie. This wasn't a hollow mask. Urahara raised an eyebrow at that thought. The figure removed the mask, stashing it in the folds of his robes, revealing the scowling face of Ichigo. A face unmarred by even a fragment of the bone-like substance which made a hollow's mask. Urahara let a sigh of relief. Ma. Ichigo. Good work. You got back your Shinigami powers, I see. Lesson 2 is now complete. Ichigo just smiled sweetly. Something in his tone made the ex-captain's spine shiver in distress. Urahara, did it just slip your mind that the shattered shaft could have turned me into a bloody hollow? The substitute Shinigami asked, making air quotes while speaking. Or did you, in your unrivaled wisdom, decide that this was a minor detail, not worthy of my attention? Don't be rash, Ichigo. Urahara smiled nervously. There was something different in the kid, something that was keeping the ex-captain on edge. Hat and clogs, I'll kill you. The smile never left Ichigo's face as he made the declaration while pulling an ebony-colored katana hilt from his robes. Urahara would have shaken his head looking at the weapon in the kid's hand. However, there was something in the way Ichigo spoke. That wasn't the boisterous declaration of an unblooded boy. On the contrary, it was a matter-of-fact statement, a promise made from an accomplished killer. Something Ichigo had no business being. Kisuke was about to retort, seeking information, when a silver energy blade extended from the hilt in Kurosaki's hand. Suddenly, a sense of foreboding engulfed the ex-commander of the R&D division of Reunited. At the same time, Ichigo's smile became feral. 2. Chapter 2, Training Version 2. Training. Disclaimer, I do not own Bleach or Star Wars. They belong to their respective owners. The story was proofread by Zanthraxone. Zanpakuto, thoughts Zanpakuto. Speech, Urahara's shop training ground. Ichigo marveled at his energy blade. It was just too damn long since the last time he held lightsaber. With the weapon in hand, Kurosaki felt like one of the missing pieces of his being was restored. He smiled and looked at Urahara. Hey, hat and clogs, I'm ready for the third test. The store owner was hiding his expression behind his trusted fan. Urahara would not admit it in front of the young Shinigami, but he was intrigued by Kurosaki's soul cutter. In all his years, he has not seen such a blade. Kisuke tilted his head to the left and smiled. This was promising to be quite entertaining. He promptly decided to disregard the sense of uneasiness which was crawling up his spine like a colony of angry red ants. Instead, the elder Shinigami declared, "The third test is simple. You just need to knock off my hat." Ichigo looked at him owlishly. That's all? He wondered and grinned. Time to take the steam out of the crazy scientist before starting with the real training. For first time since his reincarnation, Ichigo opened himself to the Force, submerging into the raw energy field. It was nothing like what his fragmented memories suggested. It felt new, primal, and unformed. He was feeling as in the middle of the rapids of a huge river. There was a lot of power on his fingertips, but he was wary. He knew by instinct that this new force was dangerous, untamed. If he lost control, the backslash could hurt him badly. Ichigo carefully molded the force through his body, enchanting his physical capabilities. Can we begin? Urahara's answer came with the hiss of a blade being drawn from his cane. The shopkeeper charged Kurosaki with surprising speed. Ichigo felt a twitch in the currents of the force and jumped back barely in time to avoid lightning-fast diagonal slash. If it was not for the warning, the substitute Reaper was sure that his torso would be bleeding right now. Despite his nonchalant attitude, Kisuke was taking this match semi-seriously. Ichigo's eyes narrowed in concentration. He was struggling to take under control his errand Reiatsu. Kurosaki knew that he should be able to use it to enhance his physical capabilities, just as he was doing with the Force right now. In a moment of supreme concentration, he felt as if breaking through some kind of ceiling. He suddenly was in a trance, his body on autopilot. Ichigo looked around. He was on the surface of an immense body of white, misty liquid, which was centered on his body. He could see and touch his uncontrolled Reiatsu. That was the key. He was finally consciously aware of his spiritual power, could feel it. This meant that he could finally control it. The geyser of Reiatsu that was his body stilled, contracted and compressed. It was awe-inspiring power. Power that was available shortly after he took Rukia's power and became Shinigami. If he knew how to control it then, things would have gone much differently. It made no difference now. He almost paid for the lack of attention with deep gash on his left arm. Only a desperate parry prevented Urahara from carving up his biceps. Yeah, no more daydreaming. This bastard is really trying to cut me for salad. the orange head grumbled mentally. He smirked when Urahara attacked again, locking blades with his sword. With a flick of his wrists, he redirected Kisuke's weapon, creating a slight opening in his opponent's defense. A lightning fast riposte followed, forcing the older Shinigami to jump back in order to avoid impalement. While Urahara pulled back for few precious seconds, Ichigo regained his balance, enchanting his body with both the Force and Reiatsu. Time to stop playing around. Kurosaki moved the fingers of his free left hand as if caressing the surface of a river, beckoning the Force to do his bidding. His arm shot forward, his hand suddenly closing into a fist and pulling back. Urahara's hat flew towards Ichigo as if pulled by invisible strings. A lazy slash later, the two halves of the hat glided to the ground. This caused the shop owner to raise an eyebrow. Not bad at all. That was an interesting trick. Care to enlighten me? That is for me to know and for you to try finding out, came the cheeky reply. Shall we start the real training, old man? Rukia won't save herself. Urahara shrugged and chuckled. He narrowed his eyes and whispered, Awake, Benihime. His blade transformed into a bit longer black-colored sword with silver hilt, which was slightly curved and covered with gentle-looking black decorative wrapping and a crimson tassel dangling from its hilt base. Nake Benihime were his next words, accompanied by a sword swing, which caused a crescent of crimson energy to charge at Ichigo, who braced his saber in two-handed grip and was barely able to deflect the energy wave to the left. The following explosion nearly threw him off his feet. Kurosaki's response was to draw on the Force and send mighty telekinetic wave at Kisuke, throwing him to the ground. Channeling more force at his legs, Ichigo leapt at his opponent, trying to nail Kisuke to the ground. The ex-captain rolled to his left and retaliated with another energy blast, which would have cut his student horizontally if he hadn't dropped to the floor to avoid it. The two combatants stranded up and took a moment to re-evaluate each other. Urahara was the more surprised of the two. His opponent wasn't acting as the untrained kid who he came to know in the last few months. Instead, he was facing and acting as an accomplished swordmaster who came twice to wounding him. What was really interesting, those close calls were not caused by mistakes on Urahara's part or pure luck on Ichigo's account. It was skill. Should have taken years of training and combat, even decades. Longer than Ichigo's time as Shinigami. Hell, longer than the kid was alive. And he was sure that the kid didn't possess this level a few days ago when Rukia was taken. Otherwise, thanks to the limiters given to the capstans and lieutenants when coming to the world of the living, young Kurosaki would have been able to crush Renji Abarai and give some trouble to the captain of the 6th. Kisuke looked at the eyes of the teen standing in front of him, and his thoughts came to a screeching halt. Those eyes did not belong to a 15-year-old teenager. They were much older. They were the eyes of a veteran. At least he couldn't sense a hollow in the kid. For now. Either the Zanpakuto spirit was possessing his wielder, or could it be? He had to ask, "Who are you?" The substitute Shinigami eyes become cold, deadly. Their gaze sends shivers down Urahara's spine. "You figured it out, didn't you?" And pretty fast. Kurosaki gave him a serene smile and softened his gaze. "I am Ichigo Kurosaki." He paused for dramatic effect. "Once I was Ichigo Kurosaki, a Jedi who became Darth Revan, the Dark Lord of the Sith who later was redeemed." He grinned mischievously and continued. "Apparently someone decided to play God and mess with my soul and Viola, a man who lived millennia before the movies gets reincarnated on Earth." The orange-haired man looked at the ex-captain waiting for his reaction. Ichigo needed a lot of help right now. The training was just the tip of the iceberg. Now that he had few fragmented memories and parts of his old personality back, he could not believe how naive he had been. Much worse, that the barely remembered days when he had been wet behind the ears Padawan on his first missions outside the temple with Master Vrook. He had no real plan, just waltz in, kick everyone's ass and save Rukia. With no intelligence on the opposition, never mind he hadn't thought to ask for even something as simple as bloody map of Soul Society. He shook his head in amusement. "Let's see if we can get some info." "Urahara, we haven't got a whole day. A Seraite that just needs invading, a princess who needs saving, and an ex-Soul Reaper who needs to answer a few questions. Ichigo grinned. Before Urahara was able to interrupt him, he continued. We both know that there is much more to her sentence than it appears. An execution for giving her powers to mortal? When the alternative was certain dead anyway. Add the little fact that she is the sole heir to a noble family at the moment. At best, there are politics at play, he exclaimed and murmured quietly. I hate politics. That's almost as bad as paperwork. Anne, what? Did you think that even the Dark Lord of the Sith can run multiple fleets and galactic empire without mountains of that stuff? Probably that's the thing that drove Palpatine insane. End rant. Ichigo looked at Urahara, waiting for answer, while he was also appraising the ex-captain. What little he could sense from his teacher, thanks to the Force, was foreboding. If they both went all way, Kurosaki knew that he'll lose. Badly. It wasn't question of raw power, although his Reiyatsu was lower than his opponent's. He could compensate somewhat for that with the Force. He had two major handicaps. First was experience. At the moment, he didn't have access to all the abilities he had as a duelist. When he was Revan, as Sith, his abilities with sword had skyrocketed, not to mention his proficiency with the Force itself, of which there were only fragments that did not make much sense. The fact that the Force itself was different here didn't help. Ironically enough, he was able to hold his own so far, thanks to the instinctual knowledge he had retained from his time as a Hollow. He could feel how to manipulate Reiyatsu. He needed more experience in combat with Soul Reapers. At least that was something his new sensei should be able to help. Where are the bloody Jedi Masters when you really need one? What was even better, the training would help deal with his other glaring weakness. Simply put, even now in spiritual form, his body was not up to the task. Ichigo was able to go toe-to-toe with Urahara after the shopkeeper transformed his sword, but only at the price of placing incredible strain on his body. And that was when Kisuke was holding back most of his speed and power. Kurosaki could push himself using the Force and Reiyatsu only so much, before tearing himself apart. He simply did not possess the toughness and endurance of centuries-old Shinigami, not to mention the speed. Now he could see it in the way the shopkeeper was moving. Behind his fool act, there was deadly grace and precision, like a lethal predator playing with its prey. Urahara finally decided to answer. Well, isn't that an interesting turn of events? Reincarnation. Kisuke did not add that this was not the person he expected to be reincarnated at all. Considering the kid's looks, he expected to be facing Kaien Shiba. What Ichigo claimed, if real, was concerning, yet it opened many new paths. Who would have thought? A Jedi, one who could use the Force. As a closed Star Wars fan, Urahara could see lots of interesting possibilities, and many new concerns that needed confirming. Was Ichigo the only Force wielder on Earth? Could there be more Jedi or even Sith wannabes around? What would happen if the soul of Force-sensitive is devoured by Hollow or become one? Those questions were only the time of the iceberg. He wondered if he can convince the kid to volunteer a few harmless experiments. And Ichigo was more mature, not that gung-ho naive kid anymore. Interesting times indeed. Now, I guess you won't spill the beans about everything you know about how Rukia's situation came to be. Kisuke became deadly serious. The reincarnated Ichigo had freely admitted that he had fallen once. Urahara decided that he cannot risk telling him about the artifact inside Rukia. Better not to tempt him. Dealing with Soul Society and the various Reapers in it would be pressure enough. He wondered if he should say something about Aizen. The problem here was that Urahara was not sure who in Seraitae can be trusted anymore. If Ichigo showed any knowledge of the captain's treason, it would prove dead sentence. He decided on a course of action. Lying outright to a Jedi, or whatever Kurosaki was now, was probably pointless, even dangerous. I've been exiled for more than a century. My information and contacts were not what they used to be. As you guessed, Rukia's sentence is unusual, especially given her station. Unfortunately, most people, including her brother, won't cross Central 46 or even question openly this decision. Why they signed her dead sentence, I'm unsure. That was true. While he knew why Aizen wanted her executed, he did not know how the traitor had managed to arrange for the government to play on his tune. Her captain, Jushiro Ukitake, I believe, will be trying to lessen her sentence or even save her if all else fails. However, most, if now all of the remaining Soul Reapers will try to stop you at all costs. Fair enough. I'll need all the intelligence you have on Seratai, maps, their most powerful people and their abilities, possible safe houses. That all, Urahara whistled. That was not the thinking of an inexperienced teen. He wondered who exactly was the man whose reincarnation had changed the kid. A way to hide Rukia after saving her, or better sending her to the living world. And of course, possible ways to rescind her death sentence. I would prefer that we won't be fugitives forever. Politics. Blackmail, possibly. Finding who want her dead and dealing with him or them. Ah, yeah. And lots of training. Right now, I'm not up to the task of saving her, and there is precious little time. Not even close to enough. Ichigo smiled. He needed to become stronger, fast. Kurosaki decided that training had to come first. He needed to give some time for Urahara to decide what to reveal. He sensed that pressing for more information right now might probe counter-productive. The substitute Shinigami cleared his mind. There was something with which the bloody crazed scientist couldn't help him anyway. Ichigo needed to know the name of his Zanpakuto. While Urahara was thinking, Ichigo left his mind wander, calling to his partner. Well, my friend, care to reintroduce yourself? I hope I'll be able to hear your name this time. There was a gust of wind to the right, and Ichigo was able to see the transparent spirit of his soul-cutter sword. The apparition spoke, his deep baritone echoing around. Ichigo, it's about time. Call me forth. There is a lovely lady I wish to dance with. The spirit smiled. Ichigo smiled. He finally heard and understood the name of his partner, his brother. It was like another piece of the puzzle that was Ichigo Kurosaki coming to its place. Another shard of his being was restored, and he was stronger for it. He whispered, "Rise, divine night." A pillar of alive, twisting darkness enveloped him, cracking the ground where he stood. When the living shadows dissipated, Ichigo was giving a darker aura. His robes were much heavier and better armored. The more profound change was a second lightsaber, held in backhand grip in his left hand. His blade's color was now deep black, much darker than the one of his robes. It was as if his sabers were consuming the light around them, causing their wielder to be obscured by twilight. Kurosaki's voice came from the shadows. "You owe me 2 weeks of training, hat and clogs. It's time to collect." At that, the teen jumped to the offense, only to be met halfway by grinning Kisuke. And why not, thought the ex-captain. It's been a long time since he had a serious workout. He had a feeling that Seratai was about to receive a long-overdue kick in their collective asses. Besides, it's been a very long time since he spared with a dual wielder. His day just got better. The teen in question was battering at Benihim with his Shikai. The energy blades were channeling Ichigo's Reiatsu, greatly increasing their striking power. Kisuke's sweat dropped. His magnificent training ground was going to be destroyed at this rate. In the following days, the two Shinigami were fighting day and night, until Ichigo's body gave up and collapsed. After a brief respite, the cycle began anew. When the 2 weeks were nearly over, Urahara decided to give his apprentice the last day off. The older Shinigami marveled at the younger man's progress. In Shikai, he could face most of the captains of Gote 13 and have a reasonable chance of holding his own until they released their Bankai. Such progress was incredible, even if he factored the boost of knowledge and skills Ichigo had gained from his reincarnation, a life about which he was surprisingly tight-lipped. While heading for his home, an exhausted substitute Shinigami thought about the little information he was able to pry from his not-sufficiently damned teacher. Urahara's mind was surprisingly well protected, as well as immune to reading through the Force. Knowing that he'll be unable to kick the ex-Capitan ass until he spill his secrets, and for the moment unwilling to do it, even if he would have had the power to do so, the orange-headed Shinigami had too little information to work with. A map of Seratai and some basic info on some of the captains. Ichigo wondered for 100th time if Urahara was sending him on suicide mission or was just plain insane. Probably both. Well, it was a standard foobar, noting he hadn't dealt with on numerous occasions. Although the price this time was much higher, Rukia's life was at stake. If she was hurt because of information that Kisuke Wind held, Ichigo swore that he'd made him pay. Interlude, Karakura Town, sometime after Ichigo's reincarnation. Keiji Momori wondered which deity he had offended in order to end this way. He was running through the deserted night streets of Karakura, chased by Wolf, like monstrosity. Something weird had happened the previous day, and he had ended as some kind of spirit with a damned chain in his chest. He couldn't interact with anyone, and now this, a damn monster had decided that he'd be a tasty dinner. Keiji sprinted into a side alley, trying to stay ahead from the sound of clawed paws splitting the ground behind him. This maneuver bought him few precious seconds. The bulk of the monster was too big to make a sharp turn easily. It was all for naught in the end. The middle-aged man slipped on an empty soda can of all things and ended in a tangled mess on the ground. He knew that it was over. The beast would be over him in a moment. He felt overwhelming fear and anger. It wasn't fair. Keiji, losing himself to unthinking rage, threw a punch at the rushing behemoth. To his surprise, he could feel a wave of force passing through him and hitting the wolf thing, staggering it. The monster roared and jumped at the stunned man. The story of Keiji Momori ended with an agonized scream and the sound of tearing flesh and broken bones. The Hollow had a great diner indeed. It looked like just another poor soul being devoured by rampaging Hollow, just another tragedy among countless others. Looks can be deceiving. Mr. Momori had one thing that made him unique. He was the first force-sensitive soul to be consumed by Hollow. And that was no trivial matter. A new breed of terror would soon stalk through the deserts of Hueco Mundo. 3. Chapter 3. Invasion of Seraite. Fifth 2. Invasion of Seraite. Disclaimer. I don't own Bleach or Star Wars. They belong to their respective owners. And this chapter was proofread by Xanthraxone. Thanks, man. Zanpakuto. Thoughts. Zanpakuto. Speech. In front of Urahara's shop, August 8th. Finally, it was time. Ichigo strode confidently towards the lair of Karakura Town, resident mad scientist. Despite his confidence, he had to suppress a slight shiver. He was always a bit nervous before deployment, something that he had inherited from his time as Revan. Only two persons ever knew that. One was his headstrong apprentice Bastila Shan. The other was his wife, Rukia. Even now he had trouble thinking of her in any other way. She was his, and he was hers. It was hard for Ichigo to think of her as Rukia Kuchiki, something he should get accustomed to, at least in the short term. He had the suspicion that a rescue accompanied by declaration of eternal and undying love, followed by marriage proposal, won't go too well. Might even be hazardous for the health. Rukia did have a temper. The substitute Shinigami stopped walking and looking up at the sky. The stars were shining, countless sparkling jewels, each one a keeper of secrets and endless promise. Another thing to consider for the future was if he could rebuild some semblance of modern technology on Earth. Granted, that was a long shot. His memories were incomplete, and even if they came back in full, he didn't know if any of technology he was familiar with would work here. He briefly wondered if the Republic, his old home, was in a faraway galaxy in this reality. Perhaps one day he'll find out. Perhaps he will walk among the stars again. He continued walking forward, thinking about his battle plan. Not that it deserved such a title. That damned Urahara did not give him up-to-date information. By the Force, even the maps he had were at least half a century out of date. Most frustrating of all, during the training, Ichigo found out that he couldn't reliably read the damned man with the Force. He didn't know if it was because Kisuke was Shinigami or something else. Hell, it might be because of the state of the Force here. Every time when he opened to it, he felt like submerging into a rampaging river. While exhilarating, it was very hard to tune to it. As a result, his senses were sometimes off. So far, he had no idea how to fix that problem. If it was fixable, that is, for all he knew, this could be a fundamental part of the Force in this galaxy, something no amount of training can eliminate. That was another problem to be dealt with later. His hand was forced. Rukia was running out of time. Ichigo expected his incursion in Seraite to be a nasty, bloody affair. The few times when he was forced to go on missions with so little information had turned into goddamned nightmares. Kurosaki had no illusions that it will be easy, even if the rescue itself was achieved without accident. As if there was a remote possibility the side of the force known by the general populace as Mr. Murphy could miss an opportunity for make itself know. Most likely, he'll have to fight his way to Rukia, and after rescuing her, the hard part will begin. They will have to find a way to overturn the sentence. The alternative was to be hunted down by a vengeful soul society. That was probably a losing proposition, unless he snapped again and went to his old ways as the Dark Lord of the Sith and tried to take out the entire Seraite. Needless to say, that was his current go-to-hell plan. Deep in thought, Ichigo reached the front of the shop, just to find himself facing Chad. His friend was sitting on a crate near the door. The ex-Jedi scolded himself mentally with the added equivalent of head slap from his Zanpakuto. He should have been able to sense his friend long before seeing him, not to mention the devil himself, Urahara, who wasn't bothered enough to mask his Reiyatsu. Ignoring Kusuke, the young Soul Reaper greeted his friend. Chad. The silent teen gave him a nod of acknowledgement. At least Ichigo sensed Ishida appearing behind him using a high-speed technique. Ishida, he added. Few weeks ago, the teen would have screamed loudly WTF. Ichigo fought the temptation to chuckle ruefully. Without his newfound restoration, or was it transformation, he still would be the loud, sometimes obnoxious teen his friends knew. Probably, in the Republic, he might have turned that way without the influence of the Jedi. At least in his both lives, his heart was in the right place, his fall to the Sith side notwithstanding. Ichigo looked at his friends with serious expression. Are you sure? Invading Shinigami Central is like nothing you've ever faced. Once we reach Seraite, there won't be turning back. The silent giant answered first, Rukia Kuchiki saved my life once. I am going. Kurosaki barely suppressed a fit of laughter. Chad was almost like a Wookiee with a life debt. He just now realized how much Chad reminded him of Zalbar. His big friend would have fit right in among the inhabitants of Kashyyyk after he helped in their liberation from Cherka. Welcome aboard, my friend. He smiled. His silent friend nodded in response. Kurosaki looked at Ishida. There was no love lost between the Quincy and any Shinigami. And you? Not that I am not grateful for your presence, but why do you wish to help rescue Rukia, a Shinigami? The Quincy stared at him impassively. I can't let it end with a loss to those two dead gods. I'll go too. Does he want revenge, or is he using this as an excuse to help his friends? Ichigo wondered. In the Force, he could sense his friend confusion. So he doesn't know. Probably a bit of the two. Good that he isn't a Jedi, or I would have to worry about him going Sith on us in the worst possible moment. But strangely enough, both Chad and Ishida had very little presence in the Force, barely above the norm for the ordinary citizens of the Republic. Urahara's was even less, just enough to be sensed at close quarters. Ah, here comes Inoue, he thought, sensing her approaching from the right. Moments later she appeared from a side alley. As he lay his eyes on her, he froze, sensing a shift in the Force. Ichigo barely heard her saying, "Now we are all here," in her calming, bubbly voice. He stayed there, rooted in place, almost stunned. This was the first time he met her after his awakening. He had missed the carnival last week in order to train. This sensation was painfully familiar. Suddenly, he was somewhere else. He was someone else. Flashback. Ichigo was back on the bridge of his flagship. He was watching the Republic task force crumble before the might of his fleet. The enemy fighter wings were being overwhelmed. Their small craft were savaged by Sith interceptors. He smirked when the shields of Republic light cruiser failed and the ship was ripped apart by turbo laser fire. The escorts of the small Republic fleet were almost gone, carefully peeled away to expose the capital ships in the center of the enemy formation. This light show was a pleasant distraction, while he waited for the core of the Jedi strike team to reach the bridge. Naturally, it was a trap. Just not for him. The nerve center of his flagship was empty, except for a couple of dark Jedi and a handful of troopers. The officers who usually worked here were in the auxiliary bridge, far away from the routes taken by the Republic commandos. He smiled when the remains of the Jedi strike team sent to stop him clashed with his guards. Revan looked at the apparent leader, a young woman barely out of her teens. Her fierce blue eyes were captivating. He could sense her exhaustion, yet here she stood, in a proud stance, clashing swords with a dark Jedi. Bastila Shan, a unique jewel, so similar to his dear wife, yet so different. An. To all perverts reading this, yes, I mean you, no, there won't be a Bastila. Revan pairing or threesome between Revan, Rukia and Bastila in this story. D. Now, on more serious note, let's continue with the story. At that moment, he received a vision of the Force, which might have cost him dearly if it wasn't for the last of his dark Jedi slowing down the strike team. Revan saw her as his new apprentice, watched how the infinite possible futures narrow down to two main paths, hanging in the balance of a choice he has yet to make. In the two paths that were open for him, both light and dark, she was there, standing by his side as one of greatest heroes of the Republic, a proud Jedi Knight on the path of becoming a master, and eventually the head of the Jedi High Council, or the darker path, a full-fledged Sith lady. Just a step bellows the Emperor and Empires, their right hand in the rising Imperium. No matter the path, she was destined to be his apprentice. He could feel a connection forming through the Force, no matter how subtle. It felt right, as if it should always been there. He also saw the inevitable betrayal of his current apprentice, Malak, a man he had considered a brother in all but blood. In just few seconds, his friend's personal squadron will open fire and end the reign of the current Dark Lord. Not enough time to raise shields or order the rest of the fleet to deal with the traitors. He was outmaneuvered by his apprentice. Part of him hated the betrayal, while deep down, he knew that it was inevitable. The way of the Sith. Another part admired Malak's cunning. His plan had slipped by the vast intelligence networks working to prevent treachery from within and interference from outside sources. Yet another raged because his apprentice didn't have the guts to face him in single combat. It was useless. For a time, the mantle of the Dark Lord will be Malak's. Only one thing remained. He locked eyes with Bastila just as the first turbo laser bolts began impacting his ship. He reached through the Force, using all his might to shield them from the bombardment. The strain was incredible. While the ship was blown apart, piece by piece, under their feet, the bridge held intact. Revan was at his limit. As shadows began to shroud his sight and his defense started to waver, a quiet, familiar voice asked, "What would you choose, Ichigo?" And then he knew only darkness. He floated in it, safe from the world within its gentle embrace. Then he was standing in a moonlit desert landscape, ghostly forms weaving around him. A wolf howled nearby, the sound causing the apparitions to scatter. He could hear the animal trotting nearby, its soft steps muffled by the sand. It barked playfully from behind. Before returning to the safe darkness, he could swear that he heard Bastila's voice as if coming from far, far away. "What is your choice, Revan?" Flashback end. Ichigo did not know how long he stayed like that, his eyes locked on Orihaime's. The memory was so vivid, like he just relieved it. Yes, the same feeling. He could feel the force in the busty teen who he was facing. It was a happy, bubbling river, bundles and indomitable. Oh yes, after dealing with Soul Society, he'll have his hands full. Inoue as an apprentice. That will be interesting. Hold this thought, he told himself. Shinsei na Yoru. He addressed his Zanpakuto in Japanese. Ichigo just now realized that so far he had talked with him using basic, which was oddly enough very similar to modern. Day English. Ichigo. He could hear his partner's acknowledgement. "You was with me even then, weren't you?" the Soul Reaper asked. "In a sense," came the gruff reply. "This is a conversation for another time. Ask again after achieving Bankai. I cannot answer you until then." That was interesting answer indeed. If he understood correctly, from what little information Urahara had given him, when in Bankai, his soul cutter spirit changed too. Sometimes to the extent of gaining a different personality. Another problem for later. "Hi, Inoue. You too, eh?" He smiled at her. She bowed with answering smile and said, Rukia needs help. We can't abandon her. His smile widened for a moment. The parallels were startling. Ichigo was about to start another hair-raising mission with a group of friends. He hoped that he'll be able to keep them safe. The cat almost caught him off guard. At first, after sensing its odd presence in the force, he thought it was a strange animal. That thought held until it came nearby. He raised both eyebrows and looked at the cat. Whoever or whatever it was, it had almost perfect Reiyatsu control. He knew that if it hadn't come closer, he would not be able to sense its power. The cat was strong. At least as strong as Urahara. He knew that he should be thankful to whatever gods existed, because sensing through the force and using Reiyatsu for the same purpose was almost identical. Thanks to that, he was able to gain control of his enormous reserves of spirit power and now had somewhat respectable Reiyatsu sensing ability. And using both the force and Reiyatsu, he was able to glimpse the true nature of the being on his left. A shapeshifter. Ichigo smiled. Now that he knew what to look for, he could feel traces of the cat's Reiyatsu on his friends. It wasn't hard to put two and two together. "What do we have here?" he said, looking at the cat with mischievous glint in his eyes. Using his best Coruscant accent, he bowed to the cat and said, "You have my thanks, milady, for training my friends." This statement got raised eyebrows from his friends. As far as everybody, except Urahara, was concerned, their new furry teacher was male. Not to mention that Ichigo was acting out of character. "You are not what I expected, boy." The cat's dry voice was obviously male. The feline turned its head, looked at Urahara and hissed. Ichigo grinned and whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "My apologies, milady. Please forgive me for revealing your secret. It is obvious you use this charade to protect yourself from this pervert," he declared, pointing at Urahara, who promptly sweat dropped. Meanwhile, the cat was on its back, laughing its ass off. Before his stunted friends could react, Kisuke grumbled and got their attention. "Okay, let's get inside. This is not the place for such conversation." He ushered them to the underground training area before the bloody kid can embarrass him further. He wasn't a pervert, right? What followed convinced Ichigo that Urahara's brand of madness was contagious. When they entered the trained area, Inoue exclaimed, "Oh, such a big space under the store. It's so cool. It is like a secret base." Then it happened. Tessai appeared from nowhere, grabbed Orihaime's right hand and started crying. Such a magnificent reaction. Tessai, am deeply moved. Kurosaki felt the need to bang his head on the nearest rock. That was way beyond Jedi strangeness and straight on the way of typical Sith insanity. He'd have to keep a close eye on these people in the future. Suddenly, he dreaded the idea of crossing dimensions through device created by those madmen. Then he paled, wondering if they will reach Seraite intact. While Urahara gave a brief and sorely lacking explanation of the Senkai Gate, the bastard tried to blindside Ichigo with his cane. Kurosaki turned around just in time to catch the offending item before it could hit him and separate his soul from his body. You never learn, do you? It is obvious why Benihim is pissed off all the time. Let's not forget this fine lady, he pointed at the cat, who is forced to be in that form so she won't be bothered by you, he growled at Urahara. Hey, I have a name, came the indignant reply in melodic female voice. Ichigo used the cane to exit his body and turned to the cat, smiling. You still haven't introduced yourself, my dear. At that, she managed to look a bit sheepish and murmured, Yoruichi. Ichigo Kurosaki, pleased to make you acquaintance. He nodded her way. What a charmer. You are nothing like Urahara described you. She tilted her head to the right and looked him in the eyes. Kurosaki or Revan, she wondered. He's definitely changed. Yoruichi decided that she should keep a close watch over him. He was an unknown element which could blow up the stewing situation in Seraite to Kingdom Come. Hopefully, after we clean up this mess, we can chat more, milady. Not to mention when we are beyond the reach of the super pervert over there. He winced at her, pointing at Urahara. Soon the preparations were done. His friends were shocked when Kisuke dropped his next surprise. The portal will be opened for only 4 minutes. Doable, but it will be close, very close. Ichigo looked over his friends and spoke confidently. The heart and soul are connected. Strive forward and don't look back. I won't leave anyone in the precipice world. It was to boost their confidence, but not even close to the speeches he had given during the wars. He was out of practice. Good that he didn't have to motivate defeated soldiers and try to rebuild shattered morale. Minute later, they were running through the tunnel leading to Soul Society. Ichigo was leading the group, cursing venomously in Hutaz, vowing bloody retribution on Urahara. The fucking tunnel was falling apart behind them. He cursed one last time and immersed himself in the Force, using a bastard version of battle meditation to energize his companions and slow the crumbling tunnel. They barely made it. Once they reached the exit, they jumped out only to find themselves falling down. The doorway had formed approximately 15 meters in the air. Ichigo was barely able to slow down their fall, enough for Inoue to use her shield and protect them from crashing on the ground. The only silver lining of this debacle was the confirmation that the Force existed, even in these dimensions, and could affect the spiritual constructs in them. "Well, that was interesting," Revan murmured. He turned his head toward Yoruichi and asked, "So what is your plan? You didn't come just as an observer, and before what happened during my training, you should have been the one leading this fine sightseeing trip." "We need to find an old friend of mine. She will be able to send us through the barrier," said Yoruichi in her male voice. She didn't mention that her original plan was to use the kids as a distraction while she investigated what the hell had happened with Soul Society and its government. Ichigo thought for a moment and noted, "How much time would it take to find her and go into Seraite?" "Couple of days, why?" He smiled, just like the old times. "Go then, I will enter the old faction way and run a recon. When you penetrate the barrier, I'll use the distraction to rescue Rukia." His declaration was met with stares. He answered them with serene smile and channeled Reiatsu into his standard Shinigami outfit, turning it in his armored robes, complete with his iconic mask. This action produced interesting reactions. Ishida's left eye started twitching. Inoue had stars in her eyes and muttered, "It's so cool." And Chad simply raised an eyebrow. Ichigo nodded to his giant friend and muttered, "Later." Only Yoruichi didn't show visible reaction. Kurosaki looked at her and said, "I know that Urahara briefed you on my abilities. I'll be all right." Not to mention that going with them and trying to protect them would greatly diminish his options. While the training they received by Yoruichi was a great improvement, only Ishida had the Reiatsu and speed to last more than few moments against a captain. Part of him hated that he was going to use them as distraction, but for the ghost of the general he had been, using such tactics was something normal, no matter how much he might regret it. Well, there was always the slim chance that he'll be able to save Rukia before they were ready to make their entrance. However unlikely that was, even if Mr. Murphy somehow failed to take notice and screw his day. Ishida pinched the bridge of his nose, trying to forestall a headache. "Kurosaki, just don't do anything stupid, all right? Like unleashing hollow bait and endangering thousands." The substitute Shinigami deadpanned, causing more eye-twitching and giggle from Inoue. "Go and be safe," he said, before disappearing in a side street. Soul Society, the evening of the same day. After a few hours of scouting around the so-called heaven, Ichigo was fervently praying that upon his death, he'll become one with the Force or transform into hollow. To put it mildly, this place was a dump. Worse, actually. It brought memories of the seedier places on Nar Shaddaa he had visited. He soon found that the local populace wasn't made by Shinigami. Small wonder. The supposed guardians of Soul Society rarely showed themselves outside Seraite. In the Rukongai, where majority of the population lived, Soul Reapers usually appeared only to recruit people with high Reiatsu, or to terrorize said populace. The ones who ventured out to actually help were few and far between. Revan shook his head sadly. Eventually, he had to do something about this. By the Force. Probably even as a bloody Sith, he wouldn't leave this mess alone. He decided to make his frustration known to the Shinigami. Ichigo headed for the so-called Gate of Pure Spirits, hoping that he won't have to harm her guardian, Jidanbo, one of the few Shinigami liked by the populace at large. When he neared the border of Seraite, a huge white wall fell from the sky, cutting access. In front of him was a massive gate. Seconds later, a giant of a man jumped between the substitute Soul Reaper and the entrance to Seraite. So, this is the Guardian. Strange haircut. Check. Metal cauldron over his left shoulder extending to his elbow. Check. 2 huge axes. Check. Sith spit. What are they feeding this one? Kurosaki wondered. He had seen smaller rankers. Damn, you are big, he muttered. Hopefully I won't have to fight him, Ichigo thought. He waved his hand at the giant, channeling the force, and spoke with power. Please do me a favor, Jidanbo, and open the gate. You can see that there are no intruders. I can pass. The Guardian looked at Ichigo with confusion before repeating absent-mindedly, No intruders. You can pass. Jidanbo turned around and grabbed the gate with his massive hands. He stayed this way for a few seconds, preparing himself, and then heaved slowly, moving the gate. Ichigo was impressed. Wow, good work, my friend. Good work. Kurosaki prepared to enter. No point in letting Jidanbo strain himself any more than necessary. He was ready to step through the threshold when he was stopped in his tracks by a silver-haired man, wearing white haori over his black uniform. The Force wielder cursed under quietly, thinking, Damn, Mr. Murphy has been working overtime. Gin Ichimaru, captain of 3rd Squad, was blocking his path. The captain smiled thinly and said, That ain't right, before unleashing his Zanpakuto and cutting deeply Jidanbo's left arm. The giant sagged in pain, barely holding the gate open. Ichigo shouted, Get that arm healed, and jumped inside Seraite, activating his lightsaber. Gin's eyes widened a fraction when he was shoved backwards by an invisible force. Ichigo entered Soresu form and glared at his opponent. Attacking a defenseless man, one of your own, pathetic. Before the fox-faced bastard could reply, Ichigo drew in the force, sending his opponent flying towards him. Wide-eyed Gin twisted in mid-air and parried slash aimed at his torso. Nice trick, the captain complimented, floating couple of paces above the ground. Ichimaru pointed his wakizashi-shaped weapon at Ichigo and said quietly, Shoot him dead, Shinso. Faster than human eyes can follow, Gin's Zanpakuto elongated and tried to skewer Kurosaki. The attack was fast, almost as fast as a blaster bolt. Needless to say, it was not nearly fast enough to evade Ichigo's senses or reflexes. The big difference was the momentum and power behind the strike, requiring Ichigo to brace his blade. If he wasn't careful, Gin would be able to batter-trove his guard and hit him. Gin's thin smile widened a bit. This opponent was unexpected surprise. Having something or someone mess up Aizen's carefully laid plans was always a bonus. Who are you, Ryoka? He asked while evaluating his opponent. You can call me Revan, was the answer, followed by Shunpo. Gin was forced to parry a slash for his eyes when his opponent appeared in front of him swinging. Ichigo jumped back, pushing away Gin with the force. Revan looked around. Bunch of unseated Shinigami and a lieutenant with tattooed 69 inches on his face were watching the show. None of them was willing to interrupt the fight. I guess it's time to clear the air. Ichigo smiled. Rise, Divine Knight. The wave of Reiyatsu, unleashed by the Shikai release, threw away all but Gin and the lieutenant. After the dust cleared, Gin was surprised by the change in this so-called Revan. He glanced over the more heavily armored robes and looked at the 2 energy blades. Shinigami, whose Zanpakuto took the form of more than one blade, were uncommon. The most famous of them were Ukitake and Kyoraku, the 2 of the most powerful captain in Gotei 13. The other notable duel, wielding Soul Reaper, Lieutenant Shuhei was watching the battle. Ichigo smiled behind his mask. He infused his blades with the force, greatly increasing the power of his strikes, and charged using Shunpo. In seconds, the courtyard where the combat took place was obscured by dust. Gin was constantly changing the length of his blade, the speed and power of his strikes much higher than his initial probing attack. Ichigo was retaliating with concentrating blast of force, channeled through his lightsabers, while he relaying on the defensive advantage of this saber form to deflect the raining strikes. They were evenly matched. Ichimaru's mastery of Shunpo and greater experience, neutralized by force-enhanced reflexes, and the Force user's ability to anticipate Jin's actions, split second before they occurred. a game of attrition which Ichigo could not hope to win. Soon the captain will receive reinforcements. And not to forget the lieutenant watching on the sidelines. 2, maybe 3 minutes, and he will have to retreat. Ichigo threw his left-hand lightsaber at Gin for the weapon to be effortlessly battered aside. Channeling the force with his free hand, Revan pulled the captain to him, staggering Ichimaru, who had learned how to largely resist the telekinetic pull and push used by the substitute Shinigami by using Reiyatsu to counter the effects of such attacks. Kurosaki shunpoed to the left side of Gin and engaged him in close combat. The following furious exchange was too fast for mortal eyes to follow. The two Soul Reapers fought to a standstill for a full minute, neither bulging or giving ground. When Ichigo was sure that he had his opponent complete attention, he summoned his second lightsaber, guiding it with the force. Its blade activated mid-air. Thanks to the hum of Ichigo's other blade, Ichimaru didn't hear the fast-approaching treat. Yet he somehow sensed the danger. In an astounding display of swordsmanship, Gin turned aside around, disengaging his Zanpakuto from Kurosaki's lightsaber, and somehow brought up his sword in time to parry the black blade centimeters from his face. That was not all. In the same fluid motion, he was able to nearly slice Ichigo's face open. Revan was saved by a hasty force-assisted jump backwards. So instead of cleaving his face in half, the captain managed to only slice his mask, which fell to the ground in pieces. The opponents were for the first time face to face. Gin's eyes widened for a moment when he noticed the spiky orange hair under the hood of his adversary. This had to be Ichigo Kurosaki, Aizen's pet project. The bastard was in for a nasty surprise. The teen was already able to fight on even terms with a captain when using Shikai. Gin believed that the kid had a chance if he didn't resort to Bankai. This kid was interesting. Both combatants turned their heads to the center of Seraite. They could sense many powerful Reiyatsu sources racing to their position. Ichigo smiled. "I guess we'll have to finish some other time." He created a sphere of force energy in his left hand and launched it at Gin, who promptly evaded with Shunpo. He was not the target, however. The sphere hit the battered ground where Ichimaru was standing, blowing a pillar of dirt and dust in the air, for a moment obscuring Gin's vision. That was all the time Ichigo needed. He dropped out of his Shikai, his second blade disappearing, and shrouded himself with the force, becoming invisible. With one last burst of Shunpo, he left, his Reiyatsu under iron control. Gin raised an eyebrow. The kid's spiritual presence just vanished. He prepared for a sneak attack. A bit of healthy paranoia hadn't hurt anyone in Seraite. Moments later, the first of the reinforcements arrived. This Revan had escaped under his nose. Ichimaru made one of his rare genuine smiles, usually reserved for Rangiku and the rare occasions when something did not go according to one of Aizen's plans. The first to arrive were Renji Abarai and Toshiro Hitsugaya. Looking at the devastation, the red-haired lieutenant exclaimed, "What the hell?" A sentiment shared by the short captain. Gin decided to answer. "Arioka. We fought to a standstill before he managed to escape. You can't miss him. He'll either have a dark mask or—" Gin looked Renji Abarai in the eyes, a very distinctive orange hair. Renji's eyes widened. Then the rest of the reinforcements arrived. Gin assumed his usual expression while waiting for the inevitable fallout of the combat. Things were looking up. Interlude. Hueco Mundo, the endless dune sea made by fine white sand, was lit up by full moon. As usual, the night was filled by the sound of various hunting hollows, some groans of triumph, others the final cries of their victims. In one area of the desert, pain-filled howl of a wolf could be heard. A dozen predators homed on the sound, anticipating easy meal. The first to arrive was a serpent-like beast with no hand or legs. It slithered on the sands like the snake it resembled, coming upon the source of pain-filled howls. The bestial hollow stopped confused. The cries were coming from egg-shaped slab of bone-like substance. It wasn't looking particularly tasty. Soon it was joined by its fellow monsters who formed semicircle around the strange object. They all looked at it unsure, while growling, hissing and snarling at each other. After all, they had to make sure that one of their fellows won't decide that they are great for lunch. A loud crack interrupted the cacophony of animal sounds. A piece from the bone cocoon had broken off, revealing female head crowned by long, curly purple hair. Deep blue, innocent eyes blinked at the wall of teeth, claws, and pincers arrayed in front of her. The girl's delicate face showed her confusion. She squirmed, trying to free herself of this strange prison. Her predicament was not lost on the hollows. To them, she was an easy prey. The serpent-like hollow slithered forward, striking with all the speed and brutality of the predator it resembled. Drops of poison flowing from its bared fangs, it never had the chance to strike the girl. With ominous hum, a dark purple blade broke through the cocoon where she was still trapped and caught the attacker under the chin, its own momentum driving it forward and splitting it open on the plasma blade. The hollow didn't have time to even scream in pain before its dying body was broken into spirit particles and absorbed by the energy sword. Everyone stayed still for a moment, mesmerized by the lightsaber. She sanded up, full of energy, the bone prison shattering under the newfound strength of her lithe frame. This action shook the hollows out of their stupor. The girl was no longer an easy meal, now she was treat that needed dealing with. Almost as one, the monsters charged her. She stumbled back, falling on the sand. Her frightened voice echoed amongst the dunes. "No, stay back." The purple-haired girl raised her left hand in what seemed like a futile stop gesture. To everyone's surprise, a wave of invisible force surged from the palm of her hand. It obliterated the remains of her cocoon, scattering its remaining pieces to the winds, then it slammed at the rushing monsters, blowing most of them off their feet. Only two to the left and one on the right remained standing. The duo was staggered and slowed down. However, the one to the right, a big insect resembling a praying mantis, had remained out of the range of the unexpected attack. The armored insect surged forward, its mandibles chittering with anticipation. The hollow was just a couple of meters away from its intended victim when the girl's eyes flashed yellow. With a snarl, she jumped in the air, energy sword swinging. She landed gracefully on the sand behind her would-be attacker. The mantis body slumped to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut, its cut-off head rolling away. The remains of the mantis promptly broke away into a shower of dancing sparkles and was promptly absorbed by the purple blade. The teenage girl's was acting on instinct, yet it was like some voice, which she couldn't hear consciously, was whispering her advice. She raised her left hand again, this time an orb of purple energy forming in her palm. "Kero," she whispered. The shimmering orb condensed into a beam and shot at the just-standing-up monsters. The resulting explosion obliterated all but the two on the left, who were coming uncomfortably close. She gripped her sword with both hands and prepared to face the onslaught. 4. Chapter 4. Night Encounters V2. Night Encounters. Disclaimer. I do not own Bleach and Star Wars. They belong to their respective owners. This story was proofread by Zanthraxone. Thanks, man. Zanpakuto. Thoughts. Zanpakuto. Speech. Seiraite. 6th Division Barracks holding cells. Rukia was sitting on the hard bed in her Spartan cell, afraid to sleep. Couple of days after her sentencing, the dreams started. They were strange, confusing, and often turning into nightmares. Last night, she dreamed of a man, who at first she thought was Ichigo. It began with her walking beside a male with Ichigo's face and orange hair, through a low tunnel, strewn with debris and covered with dust. They were accompanied by a tall, bald man, wearing yellow robes, which contrasted with her snow-white, simply cut outfit. The Ichigo, who was leading the trio, was outfitted in black, flowing robes, which looked made specifically for him. In a way, his clothes were an essential part, completing his image. The bald man asked, in an odd but somehow familiar accent, "Is it worth it, Revan?" The previous night she had dreamed that short sequence multiple times, awakening just as the orange-haired man was opening his mount to answer. That dream was accompanied by other, which she could never quite remember, just a sense of violent combat and impending doom. Needless to say, Rukia didn't get much rest that night. Her lips parted, murmuring softly, "Revan." She was testing each syllable of the word, wondering why that name sent shivers down her spine. Deep down, far below her conscious thoughts, the Kuchiki heiress felt a connection with the owner of the name. During the dream, she could swear that she was feeling his thoughts and feelings, if that made any sense. There was a great sadness, unshakable determination, and love? Who the hell is Revan? Why does he have Ichigo's face? She wondered. And why, when thinking of the person in her dreams, she felt even more regret than she was feeling toward herself for causing Ichigo's demise. She knew that the chance of Kurosaki surviving her brother attack was slim, and even if he had managed to live, then his connection to the spirit world was severed forever. Her thoughts were rudely interrupted by abrupt explosive release of Reiatsu from two distinct sources. One was definitely Captain Ichimaru. The other spiritual power was oddly familiar, yet she was not able to recognize it. The pressure was coming from the direction of the Gate of Pure Souls. The ebb and flow of Reiatsu indicated a battle. She had hard time believing it, despite what her senses were telling her. Was Seirete under attack? She wondered what was happening. Minutes later, the odd presence suddenly disappeared. Ichimaru won, she muttered sadly. The snake-like captain wasn't one of her favorite people, to put it mildly. Soon exhaustion took its toll and sent her in restless slumber. Rukia was dreaming again. She was walking on a grass-covered plain and had nested amongst low hills, no higher than 200 meters. A strange hound, colored soft brown like a light cocoa, milk mix and covered with irregular white spots. Every few seconds the beast was stopping to look at her and bark playfully. Light, warm breeze swung the knee-high grass in a calming manner. In the crystal-clear sky, the local flying fauna was lazy gliding in the air upon leather wings. It was tranquil, relaxing scene which could not alleviate Rukia's inner turmoil. She was a guest in a gilded cage while the galaxy burnt in the flames of civil war. She wasn't trusted by the Jedi, no matter that she was one of their own. In the eyes of most beings in the Republic, she was guilty by association. As far as the Jedi were concerned, she was either a ticking time bomb or a tool to be used against the Dark Lord of the Sith. Darth Revan, the great traitor, the man who sundered the Jedi Order, the general who turned on the Republic, taking a full third of the fleet with him. That's how the galaxy saw him, as a traitor and a monster. She bristled at the thought. For her, he was Ichigo Kurosaki, a Jedi Knight who dared defy the Order and led hundreds of Jedi against the Mandalorians. He was the general who stopped the clan's onslaught, the man who was responsible for slaying Mandalore himself, ending the Mandalorian Wars. More importantly, he was Ichigo Kurosaki, her husband, the man she still loved, the one she abandoned after Malachor V. Intellectually, Rukia knew she did not cause his fall to the dark side, yet there was that nagging voice in her head, one that was gaining strength each day. She could hear a ghostly whisper on the wind. "You left him in the shadows." Rukia turned her head to the left, haunted eyes searching for the sound of the voice. The hound stopped confused, left paw hanging in mid-D step. The animal shook its massive head and looked around, its ears moving like echolocators. "You were his lifeline during the war, the one keeping him sane, and you ran away at the critical moment." Rukia's attention was caught by her hound's growling. She looked to the right to see a ghostly outline of a woman hidden by a dark cloak. The apparition used its dark, gloved right hand to remove its hood, revealing a distorted mirror image of Rukia. The Jedi could see a mockery of her face, gaunt, brimmed by dark, sickly-looking veins and softly glowing yellow eyes. "You were terrified. I can sense it. Even now you reek of fear." Her double hissed. Rukia's hand moved to the hilt of her saber just to grasp air. Her lightsaber was back in the Jedi enclave, confiscated until the Masters made their mind about her fate. The Force apparition caked in sick pleasure. "Foolish girl, you were the one person in the galaxy who could have prevented the rise of Revan. Instead you abandoned him. You were so afraid of becoming me as to run away. You caused all of this." Rukia saw Ichigo laying on darkened street. His black robes were sliced open to reveal a deep slash on his chest. Cool rain was pouring on his bleeding body, a crimson stream leaking down the street. She was awoken from her nightmare by Renji's arrival at her cell door. Rukia shook her head, trying to awake. The only thing she remembered from the dream was Ichigo as she last saw him, dying in a pool of his own blood. a fate brought by her own actions. He looked at her sadly. She stared back with dark circles under her eyes. "Renji," she greeted with hollow voice. He had to suppress a glare. It was entirely Carrot Top's fault. That bastard had stolen her powers. Her condition was that meddler's fault. He grated with barely controlled voice. "Seraiti's security was breached 2 hours ago." She numbly nodded. He continued, "Captain Ichimaru fought a Ryoka. They were evenly matched." Rukia raised an eyebrow at that. Holding your own against any captain, however briefly, was nothing to scoff at. The red-headed Shinigami continued, "The intruder managed to suppress his Reiyatsu and escape before reinforcements arrived." He looked her in the eyes, wanting to see her reaction at his next words. "The Ryoka," he spat, "had orange hair." At that, Rukia's eyes widened. The next words struck her speeches. "He called himself Revan." Stupid dreams. She didn't know any Revan. Thinking about the man from her dreams, picturing his face in her mind, she was startled. It was Ichigo's, all right. His face in the dreams was mature, at least half-decade older. Despite its uncanny resemblance to Kaien, the face was without a doubt Ichigo's. Rukia stiffened. She had changed his life greatly, caused him great suffering. "Ichigo," she said quietly. Renji exclaimed, "What is with you and that bastard?" he growled. "It's his fault." "Why?" she asked boldly. "Why do you hate him so much? If I haven't given him my powers, the Hollow would have killed him and his family. Is it such a crime for a boy to be given the power to save his little sister?" Rukia screamed at him. Renji shook his head, unable to answer. It was the will of Central 46. It should be all the answer he needed, right? It was his duty as a lieutenant of Squad 6 and a Shinigami. That was the law he had to uphold, even when it condemned his childhood friend. He looked at Rukia for a moment longer and silently left, mentally cursing the damn Ryoka, the law and the injustice of it all. Small, treacherous part of his heart wondered why he wasn't doing anything to save her. At the same time, in the vicinity of 11th Division, Ichigo sneezed again. He hoped that he wasn't catching a cold, if a soul could get a cold. He looked at the map provided by Urahara and wondered what will be the best way to 6th and 13th Division's compounds. They were practically side by side in the southeast corner of Seraite. The problem was his location. After the encounter with Gin, he had ended near 11th Division. If the info given by the crazy scientist was correct, they were Soul Society's version of Mandalorians. Bunch of battle-hungry maniacs, without the redeeming feature of the Mandalorian honor code. And Gin, the man wasn't just a snake as portrayed by that chutzpahn Urahara. No, he was more like a fox, a very interesting man indeed, especially considering what Ichigo had felt when he crossed Zanpakutos with him. He was looking forward their next meeting. Kurosaki stowed the map in one of the pockets of his battle robes and headed east. He intended to sneak by 9th Division compound and reach the training areas, which he hoped to be deserted at this time of night. Then he intended to check the 4th for Rukia's captain, who, thanks to his sickness, was a frequent visitor there. According to Hat and Clogs, Rukia's boss would be sympathetic and might help rescuing his subordinate. If the captain wasn't there, Ichigo would have to choose whether to head for the 6th and rescue Rukia, if she was still imprisoned there, or search for Ukitake at his division. His thoughts were interrupted by mental slap on the back of the head, promptly delivered by Divine Knight. Once again, Kurosaki was too deep in his thoughts that he failed to keep attention on his surroundings. Damn, I have to stop doing that before I get my ass killed. Just as Revan was reaching a side alley on the deserted street he was walking on, the substitute came face to face with duo of Shinigami. He was stopped in his tracks by the sight and stared. One was a muscular, bald man with small red markings in the corners of his eyes. The other was a feminine in appearance with colorful feathers on the corners of his eyelashes. He also had peacock feathers tucked on the left side of his shoulder-length hair. Ichigo thoughts could be condensed in his colorful exclamation "Dafuk." That was prompted by the bald man's actions. He started a dance, if you can call it that, with straight face, and was repeating "lucky" with a sing-song voice. The second one looked over Ichigo appraisingly and said, "The robes aren't too unfashionable, but what's with the mask? It's ugly. An eyesore that must be removed." Ichigo's eyes twitched. No one badmouths my mask. He roared, stunning the Soul Reapers. It was a classic from his time as a Jedi and later a Dark Lord of the Sith. More importantly, it could stop a couple of high-powered blaster bolts. It had saved his life many times. More importantly, the original mask had been a present from his wife, given to him on the day when they get left for the Mandalorian Wars. He briefly wondered where that outburst came from. Until now, he hadn't remembered the origins of the mask. It just was a part of his armor. Ichigo didn't have time to think about it, because the Shinigami got out of their brief stupor and drew swords. Ichigo activated his lightsaber, assuming DM Joe stance, with his weapon held in two, handed grip above his head, and its blade angled upward and slightly behind. "Who are you two anyway?" he wondered aloud. The bald man answered, "I'm Ikaku Madaram, and the peacock to the right is Yumichika Ayasagawa." Said colorful bird glared at his partner. "You can call me Revan," said Ichigo and attacked, unleashing powerful overhand blow at Ikaku. The strike broke through the Shinigami guard, the tip of the lightsaber searing a line over Madaram's right eyebrow. In the next moment, Kurosaki was forced to parry an angry diagonal slash by Yumichika, which was the start of a series of furious attacks. Ichigo fell back few paces, waiting patiently for an opportunity to go to the offense, while weaving an impenetrable barrier with his lightsaber. He fell back a step, the feathered man following, thus gaining more distance between the Shinigami. Revan decided that this was a good moment to go to the offense. He deflected Yumichika's next slash to the side, causing him to overextend. Ichigo's following riposte made a shallow slash on his opponent's chest, causing him to jump back with a painted cry. While the lightsaber cauterized the wounds which they caused, preventing blood loss, the burns made by the energy blades hurt a lot, much more than a similar wound inflicted by regular blade. While his partner temporarily retreated, Ikaku stood against Ichigo and declared Nobiro Hozukimaru after placing his scabbard at the bottom of his weapon's hilt. His Zanpakuto was enveloped in white light for a moment, which faded to reveal a naginata, with slightly curved blade and red horsehair tassel on the pommel. Madaram went on the offense, using his weapon's superior reach. Ichigo was forced back by multiple stabbing attempts. When the next attack came, aimed at Revan's left shoulder, Kurosaki lunged forward, his lightsaber used as a lever to push the naginata away from his body. Ichigo moved toward his opponent, his blade scraping the length of the spear, burning a long gash in its wood frame. Madaram smiled at that, shouting Sakero Hozukimaru. The naginata split into a three-part staff connected by metal chain. The weapon twisted around Revan, its blade flying at his head. Ichigo promptly dropped on his knees, the blade cutting few stray hairs from the top of his head. Channeling the force through his legs, Kurosaki surged forward before Ikaku could recover himself from his failed gambit. Ichigo delivered a devastating slash, which carved Madaram from left shoulder to his right hip. Mercifully enough, Revan had held back, so the Shinigami was merely critically wounded instead of cut in two. Yumichika cried out, seeing his friend so grievously wounded. Revan lowered his blade and said, "Answer a couple of questions, and I'll let you treat your friend." The feminine Shinigami briefly glared, warring emotions visible on his face. Concern for his friend won, and the Shinigami complied, sheathing his Zanpakuto. "Where is Rukia Kuchiki?" Ayasagawa looked at him sadly for a moment. "She should be at 6th Division holding cells." He answered. Ikaku coughed a glob of blood and stated, "She is on death row. What have you got to do with such a—" He was interrupted by a silver blade pointing between his eyes, accompanied by monstrous killing intent. "Choose your next words carefully, Shinigami, for they may be your last," Revan hissed with barely restrained anger. Madaram gulped. This man's killing intent could rival his captain's. The bald man, in uncharacteristic display of common sense, stuttered, "Such a fine lady." Behind his mask, Ichigo smirked, his anger slowly dissipating. "Do you even know what her crime is?" he asked. They both shook their heads in denial. "She gave me her powers, so I could save my family from a hollow. She was wounded at the time. If she didn't do it, we all would have died." The substitute glared at them. Is your government so prideful that it prefers a Shinigami to die instead of temporarily giving her powers to one of the living temporarily? Kurosaki scowled at the duo. The wounded men were left speechless. Ichigo deactivated his lightsaber and left, melting in the midnight shadows. Yumichika kneeled over his wounded friend, trying to stop the blood loss. Madaram muttered, "They can't execute her just for that, right? There must be more to it." He trailed off. The fourth was a bust. Infiltrating it was a child's play. Once inside, all he needed to do was to find one of the night nurses in the hospital and use the good old mind trick on her. According to her, Ukitake was released the previous day and was resting at his division. Ichigo slipped out unnoticed and headed to the 13th. The possible help of a captain would be invaluable. Ichigo wondered if the security of Seraite really sucked, or all the little underhanded tricks shown him by Misson from his time as Revan were that good. To be fair, it was probably a combination of the two. Soul Society security was focused on detecting Reiatsu, which outside of combat or using Shunpo wasn't an issue for the substitute. His control had become instinctive. Being able to turn literally invisible by shrouding himself with the Force helped too. Ayan, a bunch of barley-trained teens, were able to cause chaos for days with minimal opposition and without being caught. For someone with even a part of Revan's training, infiltrating Seraite should be a walk in the park. It was in the hours before sunrise when Kurosaki found himself in front of Captain Ukitake's bedroom door. He silently opened the door and entered only to find an emaciated, white-haired man. The captain had problems breathing. Each gulp of air he took in his lungs was accompanied by wet, rasping sounds. Ichigo closed his eyes, becoming one with the raging torrents of the Force. The ex-Jedi extended his senses to the sick man. He could see Ukitake in the Force. The insides of the captain were raked by countless scars. Ichigo could see the cause. The disease was an ugly black mass, centered into the man's lungs, with oily dark tendrils spreading through his entire body. Fucking tuberculosis. And if Urahara could be trusted, Ukitake had carried it for centuries. That explained the extensive scarring which Kurosaki could perceive. The disease had devoured the captain's tissues countless times only for the flesh to be healed. But it was for naught with the cause of his illness left untouched. Ichigo wondered when the Shinigami healers last compared notes with the doctors in the living world. Tuberculosis had been treatable for decades. His opinion of Seraite's medics' competence took a sharp nosedive. After finishing the checkup and deciding that he'll be able to help the man, a sly smile adorned Revan's face. "Captain," he said loud enough to awake the sleeping man. Jushiro stood abruptly, sleep-laden eyes scanning his bedroom for the intruder, rapidly focusing on Ichigo. The Shinigami was about to say something when a vicious coughing fit forced him to double over, struggling for breath. For a moment, Ukitake was almost defenseless. Instead of attacking, the man in black robes kneeled next to the struggling for breath captain, muttering something about incompetent doctors. "Stay still," Ichigo commanded, placing a palm on Ukitake's chest. Jushiro's coughing subdued, and he started to feel better. He was slowly beginning to breathe easier as well, the wet, rasping noises slowly vanishing. The stranger was somehow healing him without using Reiatsu. "Thanks," Jushiro was able to say as his breathing stabilized. "I don't want to seem ungrateful, but I believe that an explanation of your actions is in order," said Ukitake. "Rukia Kuchiki." Just 2 words, but the masked man was able to convey a great deal with the feelings, which could be discerned in the tone of his voice. Jushiro was certain that his guest smiled under his mask while he said his subordinate's name. This man was in love. The captain lowered his head and said, "Despite my best efforts, Central 46 haven't changed their decision. The last time a Shinigami gave his powers to a human, his punishment was 6 months' prison," said Revan. Ukitake raised an eyebrow at that. He was checking about that at the library, but was unable to find anything. He said so and asked about Ichigo's source. Kisuke Urahara, the exile, so this man was an acquaintance of that man, curious. "It is strange, isn't it? The way your government decided to treat one of its own," the masked man asked. "What will you do if they don't bulge?" The captain was silent for a long moment. "I'll do what I have to do," he said finally, looking Ichigo in the eyes. An unspoken agreement passed between them. And my take on Ukitake's actions from the anime are this. He was ready to do whatever it takes to protect his subordinate from an unjust execution, but he was going to exhaust all available legal avenues before taking any drastic actions. "Good, very good," Ichigo declared with jovial tone, grinning under his mask. "Let's fix you up first. This may hurt a bit. I am Ichigo Kurosaki, by the way, but I'm known as Revan these days." Ichigo gathered more force in the palms of his hands, making them shimmer like a mirage, and pressed them on Ukitake's chest. He was destroying the disease in the captain's tissues while simultaneously jump-starting his immune system. Hours later, Ichigo smiled with satisfaction. "All done. You will be tired for a couple of days, but after that you should regain your strength rapidly." With that declaration, Ichigo's eyes rolled and he passed out utterly exhausted, causing Ukitake to shake his head in amusement. He called his third seats, Kioni Kotetsu and Sentaro Kotsubaki, ordering them to stash Ichigo in one of the division's spare rooms and make sure he is undisturbed. At that moment, a hell butterfly came in with summons for Gote. 13 meeting. He stood up, taking a deep breath. The air has never tasted so sweet. He headed for 1st Division headquarters while thinking what to say to his friend Shunsui Kyoraku. 5. Chapter 5. Who I Am. V2. Who am I? Disclaimer, I do not own Bleach and Star Wars. They belong to their respective owners. Proof read by Xanthraxoni. Thank very much. Zanpakuto. Thoughts. Zanpakuto. Speech. Noon Division 1 Headquarters. Jushiro Ukitake was the last one to arrive at the meeting, his presence causing more than a few raised eyebrows and a smile from his old friend Shunsui. Apparently Gin has fought with Ichigo yesterday and left him to escape. To add insult to injury, Gin had been missing until now. Before the meeting could erupt into chaos, Ukitake asked, "Orange-headed young man, you say?" Gin nodded, wearing proudly his signature creepy smile. Jushiro looked at Byakuya, whose right eye had twitched at his question, and continued, "Wasn't there a mention of an orange-haired boy at Rukia's trial?" Twitching from Kuchiki, a sore subject indeed, time to twist the knife. Jushiro's next question was delivered with a neutral tone, while his face was a mask showing mild interest in the subject. "Kuchiki-san, I was left with the impression that the mortal who stole Rukia's power was dispatched by you at the time of her arrest. Yet a Ryoka with the same description is loose within Serete. That's highly irregular." Ukitake turned left and bowed to the captain commander. "Yamamoto, Dono, it recently came to my attention that in the last case, similar to that of my subordinate, the sentence was 6 months in prison," he declared with conviction. Ichigo have had a copy of said documents given to him by Urahara. How the ex-captain had gotten his hands on them was a mystery. The captain commander's eyes widened a little for a split second. His answer, however, was discouraging. "It is irrelevant. Central 46 current decision stands." That little exchange produced interesting results. Shunsui was serious for once, paying close attention on the reaction of his fellow captains. Zaraki and the resident mad scientist didn't seem to care. Sui Feng was looking at Jushiro with interest, her mind considering and discarding various scenarios which could have explained the strange events connected with Rukia's trial. Toshiro Hitsugaya was scowling and muttering under his nose about troublesome old people. Byakuya was glaring at Ukitake, hating the position in which he found himself. On other hand, Aizen, Kaname Tosen, and Komamura, thanks of his helmet, had unreadable expressions on their faces, while Gin's smile had gotten wider. The captain of the fourth was looking at the chronically sick captain with the creepy smile reserved for patients ignoring her orders. He winced at that. She'll want to talk with him soon. His miraculous recovery would lead to some pointed questions from Retsu. That wasn't a conversation he was going to enjoy. The captain commander hit the floor with his wood-encased Zanpakuto, getting their attention. "Silence. As far as Rukia Kuchiki is concerned, Central 46 has moved her execution date. It is in 7 days. He glared, forestalling any further discussion. "Gin Ichimaru, The captain commander was interrupted by loud explosion. He could feel the shield protecting Siraite failing locally. The rhythmic drumming of alarms echoed over Soul Society. Go to your divisions and organize the defenses. I want the Ryoka found. This Revan is to be engaged only by lieutenants and captains. The rest should flee on sight. Captain Commander Yamamoto cursed silently. He was getting too old for this shit. Minutes before the meeting, Renji was leading a heavy guard escorting Rukia to the Senzaikyu. On their way there, they passed in full view of the execution ground and the Sokyoku. So that is Seiraite's justice. The Kuchiki hearers wondered grimly. She thought, perhaps I do deserve it, all the suffering I've caused to Ichigo. She looked at her bound hands. My arms are stained with blood, from both Kaien and Ichigo. Once she entered her new cell, her senses were dulled by the Reiatsu absorbing stone. When she was securely locked up, most of the guards left, leaving Renji staring at her with a forlorn look. Suddenly, the shield surrounding Seirite was bathed by golden light and a long bang sounded. Abarai looked up astounded to see the defenses being penetrated. 4 rods of light shot from a breach in the shield, scattering to the far corners of Seirite. Seconds later, alarms started blaring. With a curse, Renji left for his division barracks. Rukia looked through the small vertical slit in the wall across the entrance of her new accommodations, acting as a window, wondering what was happening. This place is going to hell, she said. That afternoon, the heart of Soul Society was turned into a madhouse by 3 teens, 1 Genju Shiba and a cat. If he was awake, Ichigo would have laughed his ass off. Ukitake's headquarters. Returning to his headquarters, Jushiro had his subordinates assume a largely defensive approach. Most of his Shinigami were guarding the barracks, while small recon teams were sent out. He wasn't overly concerned for his people. The most powerful of the Ryoka was napping in one of the nearby rooms after all. On the bright side, his chat with Retsu was postponed, but on the other hand, when Revan awoke, he'll go ballistic when learning about the changed execution date. Ukitake sent his third seat, Kiyone Kotetsu, to check if Rukia was moved, and if so, to find out where. The most likely location was the Shrine of Repentance, but he needed to be sure. With a tired sight, he went to his office to catch up on his paperwork, while making plans. He was sure that he can count on Shunsui's help, but wondered who else's help he'll be able to persuade. That evening, all hell broke loose. Wartime protocols were enacted in response of the assassination of Captain Aizen, which was followed by a short skirmish between Captains Ichimaru and Hitsugaya. That debacle ended with Aizen's lieutenant Hinamori in a coma. The Ryoka were blamed for the assassination, especially Revan. After checking if Ichigo had been sleep-killing captains, Ukitake called few people for a meeting in his office. Seirei was going to hell in a handbasket. First to arrive was Retsu, who didn't waste any time and started examining his health. Ukitake wisely did not protest. He was quieter than a mouse who had stumbled in the midst of a cat convention. The captain of the 4th gave him a sweet smile, which caused him to sweat profusely. There is no sight of the disease. Who and how healed you? She asked. He gulped and smiled nervously. Would you believe if I said it was a miracle? The white-haired man tried to evade. The answering stare made him shiver in apprehension. A recent acquaintance of mine. You'll meet him later today. He relented. Damn, she was a terrifying woman. Luckily, he was saved by the timely arrival of his old friend Sunishi and the petite captain of the 2nd. While quiet greetings were exchanged, Jushiro breathed a sigh of relief. Kyoraku looked at his friend, noticing with satisfaction that he was healthy. He nodded to Captain Unohana and said with a smile, I see that you've helped Jushiro. He is free of the disease, was her surprising answer. That prompted a cheer by Shunsui and light nod by Suifeng. It wasn't my doing, Retsu added, leading to confusion. Ukitake grinned and pointed to the door behind them. It is his fault, he joked good-naturedly. There, leaning on the wall in his combat robes, but lacking the mask, was Ichigo, who was studying the trio with interest. Suifeng acted on instinct. With a graceful motion, she drew her Zanpakuto and appeared next to Kurosaki, blade posed at his throat. Ichigo raised his hands in mock surrender. Shunsui looked at the orange-haired youngster and asked his friend with a serious tone. You wouldn't help Aizen's murderer, would you? So what gives? Ukitake became serious as well. He spent the afternoon sleeping over there. The white-haired captain pointed to the wall behind him and added, exhausted after healing me. Retsu smiled at Revan with a gleam in her eyes. Kurosaki felt like a mice who had gained the attention of hungry tiger. A sudden chill ran down his spine and he gulped nervously. Ichigo fought his rising terror and asked, Captain Unohana, you were the one to examine Aizen's body, right? She nodded and narrowed her eyes. Ichigo continued his line of thought. Did you perhaps found the body lacking? She slowly nodded, deep in thought. It's just a feeling, though. Despite examining it multiple times, I couldn't find anything amiss. Yet I can feel it is somewhat incomplete. Well, it won't be the first time when someone faced his own death. Ichigo shrugged, careful not to slice his neck on the blade pressed to it. Captain Sui Feng, please remove your weapon, Ichigo said and grinned, adding, we wouldn't want your hand to slip. It will make quite a mess in Ukitake's office. She glared at him, but removed her blade with a huff, still staying taunt, ready to attack. Do you believe in coincidences? Ichigo asked, surprising them with the sudden change of topic. Rukia sentencing, the rescue attempt in progress, Aizen's murder. Sui Feng caught on first. She was Serai Tai's Special Forces commander for a reason. Distractions, she spat. Revan nodded. He had done similar things a lot of times. He asked, the question is, who beside Aizen, and what is the point of this? My Aizen. Shunsui thought aloud. Did he know that you'd come to rescue her? If so, how? Ichigo shrugged. He's been your comrade in arms for a long time. You should be answering those questions. The 8th squad captain nodded. Retsu cleared her throat and addressed the substitute. What do you intend to do now? He scoffed, rescue Rukia, of course. And then, if you managed to pull it off, what would you do? Asked the Spec Ops commander. Find a way to revoke the sentence. Simply breaking her out of prison won't be enough. The captains nodded in agreement. Ukitake took a deep breath. We'll investigate Aizen's actions and try to figure his endgame. He didn't pull this stunt without good reason. You go and rescue your girlfriend. She is in the Senzaikyu, the big white tower in the inner courtyard. Unohana added, I'll arrange someone from my squad to meet you. He will give you a detailed map of the sewer network. Through there, you should be able to reach the inner grounds unnoticed. Kurosaki thanked her. Then Ukitake decided to bite the bullet. Revan, there is something you must know. The execution date has been moved to the next week, in 7 days to be precise. The 4 captains received a thorough education in Hutese, cursing in the next couple of minutes. After that, the captains managed to convince Ichigo to rest until the morning. That had 2 main purposes, to let Kurosaki's friends confuse things further and give time to Sui Feng for some creative arrangements in the search patterns of her division, leaving him a window of opportunity to reach the shrine with minimal resistance. Next morning, Siraite, inner courtyard. Late in the previous night, one Hanataro Yamada, a kind, nervous kid, came to visit Ichigo, bringing him the promised map. As it turned out, Hanataro was the one who tended to Rukia during her stay at her brother's division prison cells. What he told about her condition enraged Revan. By the force, it wasn't her fault. He had accepted her powers. Most of his suffering afterwards has been caused by his rashness and pig-headedness more than anything else. It had taken him a long time to fall asleep last night. Here he was, in the Seraitai inner sanctum, a few hundred meters from the stairs leading to the dam tower. Initially, he had intended to sneak up to Rukia's location, however he found a certain red-headed bastard in his way. One Renji Abarai, who according to Hanataro's story, had caused a lot of grief to Rukia. Stealth be damned, Ichigo thought, and went to his adversary. Renji sensed a massive killing intent heading his way. He turned to the left and looked at an approaching dark figure, black armored robes and a mask. That was more than enough to recognize the intruder from Gin's description. Remember me, you bastard, the lieutenant spat. Ichigo answered in a tone colder than the abyss between the stars. How can I forget? I owe you a debt of pain. The two men walked towards each other, a small square being their chosen battlefield. "It's commendable that you survived," Renji said in a grave tone. He continued, "I told you I'll kill the bastard that stole Rukia's power, yet here you are. You are the Hutspawn who brought her here to die." Ichigo growled and charged, delivering two-handed blow with his lightsaber. Their blades clashed and Renji was thrown back by the impact. Abarai recovered fast and commanded, "Hoiro Zabemaru." Renji's soul cutter changed into a segmented sword, each segment having an ice pick-like protrusions on the front and back. Now the Zanpakuto was more like a serrated whip than a sword. The lieutenant boasted, "When we fought in the human world, I had a limiter, as all lieutenant class and above. I'm 5 times stronger here." "You talk too much," Revan deadpanned, channeling the force into telekinetic wave, which sent Renji through the wall of nearby building. In the palm of Kurosaki's left hand, a sphere of energy formed. It could be seen how it was twisting and expanding by gathering spirit particles from the air. Ichigo was improvising, combining the force with Reiatsu for his next attack. He sent the ball of energy at the building in which Renji had landed. It went in the hole which Abarai had made and exploded with the force of a thermal detonator. The building was blown apart. If Renji was human, this would have been the end, the shockwave destroying his body. Instead, the Shinigami evaded the brunt of the attack by using Shunpo. He appeared in the square, covered with dust. Renji attacked, using his Zanpakuto as a whip. Ichigo jumped in the air, avoiding the hit, which left a deep gorge in the cobblestones. Kurosaki was floating a meter above the ground, using Reiatsu. "Time to get serious," he thought. "Rise, Divine Knight," Ichigo said, mentally adding, "Let's kick his ass, partner." A pillar of red and black Reiatsu later, Renji was facing a dual-wielding opponent. Ichigo had his sabers crossed, sparks flying from the touching blades. They clashed again, each exchange of strikes pushing Renji back. The lieutenant's attacks were pretty strong but predictable, making the precognitive abilities granted to Ichigo by his connection with the Force redundant. Revan was able to read the lieutenant's attack patterns easy. Kurosaki used his left blade to stagger Zabemaru while it was folding after finishing an attack sequence. This permitted Ichigo to enter Renji's guard and deliver a devastating kick between the Shinigami's legs. The lieutenant fell to his knees, whimpering, clutching his family jewels. In Kurosaki's mindscape, his Zanpakuto spirit was howling with laughter. "That wasn't his ass," he managed to say. Ichigo tried to pierce Renji's left shoulder while the lieutenant was incapacitated, but the Shinigami managed to roll aside in the last moment, the blade cutting his sleeve. While rolling, the red-headed man grabbed the hilt of his sword and swept the weapon at Kurosaki's legs. The armored man jumped over the strike. Still in mid-air, Revan threw his right lightsaber at his opponent. This time, Renji was unable to react in time, the black blade grazing his left arm. Renji groaned in pain and attacking again, hoping that now he had an advantage despite his wound. His Zanpakuto howled forward, aimed at Ichigo's chest. It did not connect. Wide-eyed Abarai watched in morbid fascination how his blade was stopped in mid-swing by invisible barrier. Ichigo was mixing the force with Reiatsu again, this time erecting a shield between himself and Renji. Revan could be seen stretching his right arm forward, his hand raised upward. And that was apparently sufficient for the weapon to stop, harmlessly centimeters from Ichigo's fingers. While Renji was still gawking, the Force user summoned his saber and acted. He crossed his blades, catching Zabemaru between them. Ichigo channeled the Force through his right lightsaber and Reiatsu with the left, the energies mixing at the place where the three swords met, glowing with blinding light. Ichigo concentrated the energy in a single point of Zabemaru, right between two of its segments. The unstable mix of two different energies exploded like a shaped charge, shattering Renji's Zanpakuto. The backslash of the energy release manifested in a jet of plasma, splashing over Abarai's torso, leaving a deep smoking ruin in its wake. The lieutenant fell backwards and hit the ground, coughing blood. His unnatural Shinigami resilience was the only thing that kept him alive when struck by plasma hot enough to melt a cruiser's armor. Ichigo deactivated his weapons and went to his fallen opponent and saying, "It's not me you truly hate. You wish to be the one to save her. The one you despise is the man whose image you see in the mirror every morning. The Shinigami who brought Rukia to Seraite to be imprisoned and executed. The one who doesn't have the guts to save his precious childhood friend." With those words, Revan left, running to the Senzaikyu. Before falling unconscious, Renji told his Zanpakuto, "When I heal, I'll take your test." A black cat watched the battle from nearby rooftop. When Kurosaki disappeared up the stairs, the feline jumped down and went to the wounded man. In a puff of smoke, the cat transformed into a stunning purple-haired woman. Yoruichi kneeled next to Abarai, took out a medpack and started tending his wounds. Halfway to the shrine, Ichigo was stopped in his tracks. There was a pink-haired little girl on his shoulder. He never sensed the kid coming. Kurosaki jumped in the air when the she screamed in delight, "Kenny, I found him!" Oh boy, this did not paint a pretty picture. Ichigo knew of only one Shinigami who could be addressed this way, by the girl. The bundle of energy sitting on his shoulder was dead giveaway too, when he thought about it. "Kenpachi, fucking Zaraki!" Kurosaki groaned. Kenny, who turned out to be a 2 meters tall giant, lumbered in sight. He had black hair, turned into spikes forming a halo around his head, with honest-to-God bells on the tip of each one. What the hell is wrong with those Shinigami? Revan thought. During his Dark Lord days, his craziest Sith were looking great by comparison. Ichigo could feel the Force whispering to him, "A battle-hungry maniac, bloodthirsty, just as you were, Revan." "Child, you should go," Ichigo told the pink-haired girl on his shoulder. Kenpachi grinned. He could sense no fear. Good sharp Reiatsu to boot. Yashiru jumped off Ichigo and disappeared after telling Zaraki to have fun. Kenpachi propped his serrated Zanpakuto on his right shoulder. Ichigo drew his weapon and entered his favorite DM Joe stance. "Fine stance," Kenpachi complimented and continued speaking. "Few possible openings, nice spiritual power too. I can see why Madaram lost." "You are not an opponent I can hold back against," Ichigo said and declared, "Arise, divine midnight." Unknown to his opponents, Revan had used only the light side of the Force so far. Not anymore. Now his first release had a significant difference. Instead of 2 lightsabers, he had one. Its hilt was longer, with a ruby at its bottom. The energy beam was longer as well, but narrow with a defined edge. It had a deep crimson color. Ichigo grinned, feeling the full power of the Force for the first time after his reincarnation. The river that represented the Force in his mind was colored crimson, its pressure becoming thicker. He was facing a warrior who will push him to the limits. Revan smiled under his mask, lips stretched in the same smile which he had when facing Mandalore so long ago. Ichigo's warrior blood singed at the challenge. Sensing Kurosaki's intention, Kenpachi laughed aloud. "That's what I'm talking about." The madman roared and charged. They met at the middle of the stairwell, swords crashing with tremendous force. A shockwave created by the impact shattered all nearby windows. Ichigo was channeling so much of the Force in his blade that it was shrouded by unholy light. Kurosaki swung a mighty 2-handed strike which met Kenpachi's blade. The energy enveloping Revan's lightsaber was not stopped by the enemy Zanpakuto, merely blunted, and it slammed in Zaraki. A pillar of dark side energy struck the bloodthirsty captain, decimating his clothing above the waist and causing few shallow cuts on his chest. "Splendid!" roared the maniac, swinging his weapon wildly. They clashed again and again, neither giving ground. Soon the aftershocks of their strikes obliterated the ground under their feet, making a meter-deep crater. The combatants didn't notice, too intent to kill each other. Every strike was parried, yet they were bleeding, struck by Reiatsu or Force aftershocks. Both of them were covered with lacerations, blood flowing freely, yet the grins of pure joy never left their faces. For 5 minutes they stood their ground, weaving a tapestry of steel and energy, painting it with ample qualities of blood. The combatants were exchanging strikes furiously, creating tremors and shaking the nearby buildings. They were in the eye of a steel storm, the flow of combat balanced on a knife edge. It couldn't last. One more moment of twisting steel, and the stalemate was broken. Ichigo parried a strike that would have eviscerated him and counterattacked, slashing at Kenpachi's head. It connected, giving Zaraki a matching scar on the right side of the face, destroying his eye patch. That was a mistake. A torrent of yellow reiatsu engulfed them, forcing Ichigo on one knee. The Shinigami looked disappointed. "Is that all?" the captain asked. Ichigo gritted his teeth, flared his spiritual power, and stood up. "Better," exclaimed the maniac, his Zanpakuto slashing horizontally. Kurosaki's lightsaber was battered away, crimson line opening on his stomach. From here on, the duel went downhill for the ex-Sith. His guard couldn't stop Kenpachi's doubled strength. He fell back, receiving wound after wound. Suddenly, his back hit a wall. In the next moment, Ichigo was impaled to it by Zaraki's blade. "I hoped for better fight," grumbled the captain, retrieving his sword. Ichigo slumped silently to the ground, his eyelids heavy. "Is that all there is to my strength?" he wondered. As his eyes were closing for one final time, he was yanked into his inner world. It was different, another place altogether. A familiar corpse-filled battlefield, the same one where he lost his wife. He was flanked by two versions of his Zanpakuto. To the right, a grey-robed apparition shining brightly with the light side of the Force. To his left, a figure cloaked by shadows, yellow Sith eyes piercing the darkness. "A Jedi," said the dark. "A Sith," chorused the light. "Both, neither," they said in the same voice. "Ain't you full of shit?" added a new distorted voice. The air before Ichigo shimmered, a mirage gaining substance. He beheld a white copy of himself, Kurosaki's brown eyes locking with black orbs divided by yellow, sprinkled with darkness-slitted irises. Revan noted in recognition. It was his hollow version, the being he became when he lost Rukia and died in despair. "That was pathetic, King," the hollow chastised him. In a buzz of sonido, the doppelganger grabbed Revan and smashed him in the ground, towering over him. "We can't save the Queen this way!" With every word, he picked up Ichigo and smashed him in the ground. The hollow threw him away in exasperation. "King, you have to get your head out of your ass. Your blades are dull." He pointed at the two spirits with scorn. "Light side, dark side, my ass." Ichigo looked with confusion. He had done just that, didn't he? He had used both sides of the Force against Kenpachi. "And I lost. He wasn't strong enough." "Bullshit. Even as fucked up as you are, you held your own until you gave in to your fear." At that, Ichigo raised his head, becoming angry. "I threw everything I have against that bastard," he screamed. He just laughed and kept coming. "Everything? Everything, you say? You don't remember your vow. We have a pact, and you will uphold your part of the bargain, even if I have to kick your ass until you remember." The hollow drew a lightsaber and activated it. The blade was a shade of white, the color of a hollow's mask. It morphed, becoming solid, shining with an energy field which enveloped it. "If you are too weak and surrender to despair, I'll take control and take Rukia," the hollow declared. He pointed the blade at Ichigo, channeled a crimson sero, threw it and launched it at the king. Revan jumped out of the way, the shockwave of the explosion sending him into the burning wreck of Mandalorian basilic droid. He bounced off the armor plating, just to be shot down by a bala while falling down. The sound of sonido was all the warning Ichigo got, followed by a sadistic kick in the spine. Kurosaki could feel his bones cracking. The hollow appeared in front of him and kicked him again, this time sending him through a nearby boulder. The doppelganger went to a stunned Ichigo and placed hand on his forehead. "Will you accept that?" he screamed, showing Ichigo a vision of Rukia's execution. She was suspended in the air, held immobile by stone cubes, humming with reiatsu. She was facing a giant flaming phoenix which was radiating an immense power. The bird made of fire screamed once and flew forward, engulfing Rukia. She gave one agonizing shriek and disappeared, her very soul turned into ash. No chance to become one with the Force, no chance to rejoin the cycle and be eventually reborn. She was simply gone. Ichigo stayed stunned for a long moment, his mind refusing to comprehend what he just saw. Rukia, the woman who was his wife's reincarnation, gone, erased from existence for all time. Boundless, terrible fury engulfed him. He roared, releasing all the pain and suffering accumulated during his both lives in an unintelligible, blood-curdling howl. Midnight black Reiatsu was engulfing Revan. His robes morphed into Mandalorian-designed armor forged from living shadows and covered by cloak of darkness. Ichigo's lightsaber blade changed into that of a katana, extending from the cylindrical hilt. Kurosaki's eyes met the sight of his hollow, and he nodded in understanding. Ichigo, the son of Kurosaki Isshin, had accepted Darth Revan as a part of himself. This deceptively simple act reformed the teenage substitute, Shinigami, into the warrior general who had brought the Mandalorian clans, the Republic and the Sith Empire to their knees. It was that simple. Ichigo just had to accept who he was now. Not only intellectually, which had happened soon after exiting the fucking shattered shaft, but emotionally. Deep down, the youth he was could not accept the part which had bathed in the blood of billions. And that was a critical shard of his being, forged in all the wars he had fought. He could remember now, everything up to the moment he had become a hollow, but that is a story for another time. Kneeling before Ichigo was his Zanpakuto spirit. It had changed. He had turned into white-haired, middle-aged woman who was wearing armor similar to Ichigo's, but forged of silver battle steel. His Zanpakuto oval face held a sort of cold, savage beauty, the sort you can find in the deadly embrace of the Arctic. "You finally know who you are, King," said the hollow. Ichigo Revan Kurosaki, a specter of a dead man, merged with a not-too-bright teenager. Do you know that originally, Revan was not my Sith name, but a nickname given to me by the local on a god-forsaken world on the Rim? It meant protector. Later I took it as my Sith name because it was a symbol. My ultimate objective was to prepare the Republic for the coming of the true Sith. Ichigo was interrupted by a bored hollow. You won't recap your life story now, right? Been there, done that, got the scars. The doppelganger deadpanned. Your sense of humor can use an improvement. Kurosaki scoffed. The hollow laughed madly and asked, his expression growing serious, "Who are you, King? A Jedi, a Sith, a Shinigami, a general without an army?" Ichigo's eyes became cold as he continued speaking. A knight of the Force, the butcher of Malachor V. The general's eyes widened in understanding, and he looked at his hollow. That's when you were born. My actions that day created a tear in the Force and a void in my heart. Bravo, give the winner a biscuit. The hollow smiled grimly. It all began there. You made us unique, pawns in the most important game of cosmic chess to be ever played. And you just promoted yourself to a knight into that game, my general. Ichigo felt a strange foreboding at the words of his mirror image, as if he lacked the reference to comprehend their true meaning. You know, it's good to have you back, Revan. The hollow smiled. The doppelganger said in a serious tone, There will be a time when I'll ask you what you are. King, for all our sakes, you had better have a good enough answer. Oi, almost forgot. Go kick some Shinigami ass. The hollow laughed and dispersed in thin air. Revan shook his head in exasperation and turned to his Zanpakuto. Until now you was incomplete, a reflection of shattered mind. After your reincarnation, your soul could not handle all of the Reiatsu you had. It was fractured, wounded. Being a hollow for so long left its marks. Until now, your hollow side was unable to manifest. If it had done so, the pressure would have shattered your very being. The wall dividing Shinigami and hollow is broken in you, Ichigo. While our soul heals, you won't be able to reach your full potential. However, there is a silver lining. You'll be able to use powers from both sides, she said in a cool, lovely voice. That was a problem for another time. It might be years until his soul heals. Kenpachi was heading away from his fallen opponent. It was good battle, not good enough, unfortunately. A wave of Reiatsu staggered him. He whirled around, sword raised just in time to parry a slash aimed at his head. Ichigo was looking unharmed. Reiatsu whirled around Kurosaki, his robe shrinking and changing into slick black metal armor. Revan grinned and said, "Rise from the abyss between the stars, divine princess." Ichigo's lightsaber was transformed by a wave of starlight, taking the form of long black katana. The blade of the Zanpakuto was sparkling with cosmic energy. Zaraki's demonic laughter echoed around them. Chapter 6, A Glimpse from the Past. A Glimpse from the Past. Disclaimer: I do not own Bleach and Star Wars. They belong to their respective owners. Proof read by Xanthraxoni. Thank very much. Zanpakuto. Thoughts. Zanpakuto. Speech. Seiraite in a courtyard. Revan smiled thinly at the brutish captain in front of him. The general held his Zanpakuto in a one-handed dueling stance, his free hand cracking with energy. Ichigo waved his left arm at Zaraki, a ripple in the air marking the only obvious effect of his attack. Kenpachi stumbled mid-step, his movement suddenly slowing down. The giant of a man felt as if he was in a pit full of quicksand, the stuff sticking to his frame and making him sluggish. Ichigo wasted no time in exploiting the advantage he created, moving like water around his slowed-down opponent. Kurosaki delivered a series of slashes, opening angry red lines in the muscles of the giant man. Instead of faltering because of the wounds, Kenpachi smiled like the madman he was and screamed in joy, "This is it! Show me more!" Zaraki dispelled the energy, slowing him down by spiking his Reiatsu even further. His swings became wilder, harder to predict. The lunatic caught Ichigo's blade at his next swing with a hand encased by yellow Reiatsu. Despite that, the Zanpakuto bit deep in the palm of the captain's hand, scraping at the bones. Kenpachi retaliated, aiming his sword at Kurosaki's left shoulder. Revan was surprised by the actions of this madman, reacting a split second too late. The general managed to create partially formed barrier of Reiatsu and the force, which prevented the captain from killing him outright. The Zanpakuto still bit deeply in Ichigo's shoulder. Revan was unperturbed at the wound. He left his sword, still embedded into the Shinigami's arm, and took a step forward, Zaraki's blade biting even deeper into his flesh. Ichigo placed the palm of his right hand on the stomach of Kenpachi. Midnight black strands of energy were weaved into perfect sphere by Ichigo, and he shouted, "Zero!" An explosion of darkness separated the opponents, throwing them in separate directions. The sudden motion widened Kurosaki's wound. The general's right hand was a charred ruin, bones protruding through burned-out flesh. He was the lucky one. Zaraki had a gaping hole in his guts, showing many of his organs ruptured and cooked by the searing heat. Both opponents' forms were left where the explosion threw them, blessed unconsciousness claiming them. Rukia's cell. It was a fine day. Cloudless, with the sun shining brightly, yet its rays were merely warming pleasantly instead of scorching with their heat. A light wind was bringing fresh air from mountaintops far away from Seiraite. If her circumstances were different, Rukia would have enjoyed the great weather immensely. Instead, she was cooped in a death roll cell, wallowing in pity. Here her dreams had intensified in the last couple of days, leaving her chronically restless. The Kuchiki heiress was wondering if she was going insane because the whispers she heard in her head beside Sode no Shirayuki. If one had an active imagination, then he would be able almost see a bunch of storm clouds gathering over her and soaking her with despair. Suddenly, she bolts upright, her eyes centering on a specific point of the floor. Her gaze was so intent, as if the reishi rock was transparent, and she saw beyond it. Rukia could feel the change, the whispers cooing in confirmation. For a moment her world stayed still, and then she felt a gentle wave of energy washing over her body. It was making her nerves tingling with excitement. She had never felt more alive. Rukia was bathed by a calm current, the energy slowly entering her body, recharging her. The feeling was made much more potent because of her current situation being surrounded by Reiatsu countering material. Her newfound joy was interrupted by sharp pain in her left shoulder, as if a jagged blade had bit deeply in her flesh. Rukia hissed in pain, wondering what was happening. She could feel a new sense unfolding, following the all-encompassing stream. She could feel a blazing ribbon of energy connecting her through this strange new force to a man whose mind was a mental fortress. It was as if she was watching his actions from somewhere outside his body. He was wounded, It was his pain she felt throbbing in her shoulder. Rukia could sense a torrent of dark, hollow-like energy gathering in the man's right hand. There was the sensation of release, and her arm exploded in searing pain, like it was submerged in a vat of molten metal. She screamed, the agony overloading her nervous system. Rukia fell to the ground with her mind still plunged into this strange connection. Shared mindscape. When the pain lessened to a dull ache, Rukia found herself in a room full with dozens sparkling fountains. This beautiful place was familiar, bringing comfort to the distraught Shinigami. She knew this room as if she had spent many hours relaxing, listening to the calming bubble of the water. This was my favorite place in the temple. A familiar voice startled her. Rukia whirled around to face its owner. Ichigo was walking to her, dressed in black robes. His form was streaking between the fountains, producing a sense of déjà vu. As if she had seen him in this room many times. She ran to him, desperate to see if he was all right. "Ichigo!" she exclaimed with relief in her voice. He looked fine, unharmed. Relief was soon replaced by anger. She shouted at him, her voice thick with emotion. "It was foolish to come here. I told you not to follow me." Ah! Kurosaki's smile was extinguished. This was not shaping to be the reunion he was hoping for. He knew in his mind that this Rukia, while she was his deceased wife's soul, had none of the memories of their previous lives. Yet that fact did not help him feel heartbroken at knowing she did not remember him, so did not love him as something more than a tentative friend. "You have to run back to the living world," she continued frantic. Ichigo placed an index finger on her soft lips, silencing her. He waved at the room, saying, "Do you remember this place? The last time we were here, the room of 1,000 fountains was a battlefield." Rukia opened her mouth to say no when she could feel a blazing light pulsing through the connection in this strange new energy field. For a moment, the Kuchiki heiress wondered how she managed to forget something so significant. Then she had a revelation. It was in the way the bond felt, natural, a part of her that has always been there, just as any other sense. You do not need a conscious effort to hear or feel a touch. But now, when she was aware of the connection once again, Rukia could see it blazing, a starlit bridge connecting her with Ichigo. The bond pulsed as alive and plunged them in a vivid dream of the past. Flashback, Jedi Temple, Coruscant. Jedi Master Rukia Kurosaki was coordinating the last-ditch defense of the Jedi Temple. The Sith assault had caught them by surprise, dozens of Jedi dying in the first minutes of the attack. She was using the Force to heal a severely wounded Padawan who had run afoul of one of the Empire's bounty hunters. The young Tortuga had been shot twice with powerful blaster, surviving so far only by the will of the Force. Rukia smiled to the hurt boy, hiding her desperation well. She could hear the fighting coming near, the Jedi and what few Republic troopers were left falling back before the Sith onslaught. There were no reinforcements coming. The Empire had struck with overwhelming numbers, sending 5 full fleets to this campaign. Coruscant system defense forces were being slowly ground to nothing, pinned against the planet by most of the enemy capital ships. This still left scores of cruisers and hundreds of troop transports free, 11 of which were descending over the Senate building and the temple. They were preceded by waves of bombers, gunships, and assault shuttles. The few units of the Republic Army, which were close enough to reinforce the 2 strategic buildings, were unable to do so. All the soldiers were dying, overran by swarms of Sith. Rukia looked around the room, in which the major part of surviving Jedi still on Coruscant were about to make their last stand against the darkness. This should have been a place of reflection and spiritual healing. Instead, the Room of 1,000 Fountains was made into improvised triage center and was about to become a battlefield. The building shuddered, the loud crashes of assault shuttles delivering more enemies echoing through the temple. It won't be long now. Rukia did what she could for her patient and made her way for one of the doors, her lightsaber in hand. She silently thanked the Force that her husband was off-world, commanding the campaign in the Corellian sector. With Revan surviving the inevitable fall of the planet, the loss of Coruscant would not be the death blow for the Republic that the Sith intended. The Jedi ran out of time. A solid wall of war droids, followed by a phalanx of energy shield-equipped stormtroopers, crashed at the barricades blocking the entrances to the room. Rukia found herself in front of Commando Squad, the Republic soldiers pouring a torrent of blaster fire from their assault cannons. They were reaping swathes of the enemy troopers and droids, yet it was not enough. The robots were expended as living shields, allowing the stormtroopers to come in close. The commandos could not take down the enemy soldiers fast enough. They claimed 4 Sith troopers for every one of the Republic men and women who fell, but the enemy had the bodies to spare. Soon, Rukia, who had been telekinetically slamming objects at unlucky enemies, found she was too busy with deflecting blaster bolts. The Sith had won the outer barricades over mountains of their dead. However, now they were able to fan out in the vast room and use their superior numbers to greater effect. Jedi and Republic soldiers alike were pushed back into ever-shrinking perimeter. Groups of Sith warriors were appearing behind the stormtroopers. Their crimson blades were thirsting for Jedi blood. The new enemies were taking positions, ready for the final assault. A hail of blaster bolts paved the way, followed by Sith warriors. Rukia threw away a squad of troopers, their bodies hitting a nearby fountain's marble walls. They died with the sound of shattering bones. She deflected a long burst of fire, returning it to the senders. Her victory was short-lived, however, as 4 Sith warriors chose her as their next target. She was forced to fall back by a solid wall of plasma blades and their wielder who were charging her. Series of deafening explosions shook the Jedi Temple, their sound overlapping to create a continuous crescendo. Another round of tremors followed, even more assault shuttles blasting their way through the building's walls. The Sith advance faltered, their combat network filling with warning messages. Suddenly, the Sith onslaught abated. Most of them were falling back to defensive positions. Rukia breathed a sigh of relief. She could feel a shift in the Force. The sense of impending doom and encompassed darkness that had been a constant companion since the Sith attack on Coruscant lessened. Rukia felt like the universe was taking a deep breath, waiting while the balance between light and dark was balanced on a knife edge. The fate of a galaxy rested on the shoulders of a single man. Ichigo Kurosaki was on the bridge of his flagship, victorious, flanked by 2 old friends. On his left was the Grand Admiral of the Republic, Karth Onasi. The years were kind to the man. His face was the same the Jedi remembered from their escapades on Tarsis and beyond, if with a bit more worry lines. The flag officer's short grey hair was giving him a distinguished look. Onasi was wearing a deep frown, wondering whether Revan has finally lost his mind, or if the former Dark Lord of the Sith was an evil genius. To the right of the general, clad in gunmetal-coloured armour, was Mandalore. Canderous Ordo, who despite his advanced age was still one of the fiercest warriors in the galaxy. The grizzled old warhorse had reformed his people after the end of the Jedi Civil War. He had gathered the scattered clans, ending their raiding days and reforming them in a new nation. In the 2 decades since that war, they were on the ascension, becoming a power to be reckoned with in their sector of the galaxy. "What will it be, Revan?" asked the Mandalorian warlord. Ichigo's sight was locked on the hollow projector, watching the battle playing out. He had sufficient forces to save the besieged Coruscant defense fleet, but that would mean the fleets with which he had just jumped in system would be decimated, and they would have to flee afterwards anyway. Revan knew that Sith High Command had placed absolute priority on this operation, with 2 more fleet racing through hyperspace to reinforce the Sith armada already in system. The Emperor and his cronies were hoping for a political knockout blow, which will buy them time to consolidate the captured territories and rebuild their forces, something Ichigo could not allow. He cursed, sadness evident in his eyes. It was time for another one of those decisions, the ones because of which he was known to many as a cold-hearted butcher. Karth, order the Coruscant fleet to reform in formation Gamma 1-3. It will buy them few more minutes. Mandalore, I need you to lead the relief strike to the Senate, save whoever is left and evacuate. We can't hold the planet, and I won't waste any more lives than necessary. Our fleets will attack the Sith formations here and here. Kurosaki pointed at the 2 enemy forces that had bypassed the system defense fleet and were attacking the capital world. They consisted mainly of transports and planetary assault cruisers, with relatively few dedicated capital ships. and their lighter escorts. Ichigo planned to overwhelm them fast with the superior numbers and firepower of his 3 fleets. He had to thank the Force for the Sith's impatience. The Empire had attacked a couple of centuries before Revan thought them to be fully prepared to take on the whole galaxy. That had cost the Republic in the early years of the war, but it had its silver lining. If the Sith kept their original timetable, the force Ichigo was commanding now would not have the decisive effect it had nowadays. He was leading 3 fleets made by Starforge-created ships, which would have been hopelessly obsolete in a couple of centuries. However, right now he had nearly 3,000 ships of all classes, not counting fighters, bombers, and shuttles, ready for action. It was a force with which Revan could decide the outcome of the war. At this very moment, both sides had committed their reserves in battles across 1,000 systems. And the Republic was holding, bleeding the Sith who were attacking in the teeth of prepared defenses. The general was content to let them have the capital, for he was ready to turn the masterstroke of the Sith High Command in a strategic defeat they could not hope to recover from. Thousands of ships were busy delivering millions of mines on the hyperspace routes leading to the plane. Considered by many the center of the galaxy, he had gathered those vessels by cutting to the bone the defense forces of hundreds non-essential worlds, leaving them defenseless and their government screaming bloody murder. The Sith leadership would know in hours at best, but it would be all too late. The 2 reinforcing Sith fleets were already past the point of no return, too deep behind enemy lines, with mine layers busy behind them, cutting them off. Karth looked at the holographic representation of the system defense fleet and muttered, "Those poor bastards," the Admiral thought. "Karth, I'm leaving the space battle to you. Deal with those 2 forces and commence long-range bombardment on the forward elements of those assault fleets. We have about 80 minutes of free rein and will retreat afterwards. Whoever is not aboard our ships by then will have to look after themselves." "I'll deal with it. May the Force be with you," the Admiral said with a grim voice. "And with you, old friend." Revan nodded to Karth and left. Onasi hated the plan. It left hundreds of thousands of his fellow soldiers to die. But he was aware of the strategic situation. The Republic was tired of the wars, and the time was nearing when the whole House of Cards could tear itself apart from the inside. That was something the fucking Sith were counting on. "Good luck," said Canderous, and left the bridge on the heels of Ichigo. They were running to the docks, where assault shuttles were preparing for liftoff. Meanwhile, a division of experimental dreadnoughts, armed with ion cannons, took position and started blasting at the Sith cruisers, which had made planetfall and were providing close air support to their ground forces. Division after division of Republic cruisers, arranged in formations maximizing the number of ships which could bear their guns on the enemy, fell upon the 2 Sith fleets which were supporting the ground invasion. Red turbolaser bolts clashed like an avalanche on the straining shields. 251 wings of Republic fighters clashing with the pathetic CSP, Combat Space Patrol, which the enemy fleet had, most of its fighters and bombers supporting the ground pounders. The duel between the small craft ended in minutes, with the Sith ones being blown out of the sky. Fighters and bombers swarmed over the Sith fleets, supported by waves of missiles and proton torpedoes launched by the Republic heavy ships. The local advantage of the Republic forces was too great to withstand for long. Reinforcements from the assault fleets engaged with the system defense forces were 10 minutes from effective range, and that turned to be 3 minutes too late. In just 7 minutes, the cream of the Sith ground forces were decimated. 80% of them snuffed out of existence on board of their transports or blown away in the assault shuttles while trying to make planetfall. Coruscant, Jedi Temple. There were less than 100 Jedi and commandos still standing when Revan and his reinforcements disgorged from assault shuttles. Squads of Republic Special Forces and Mandalorian heavy troopers marched through the halls of the temple, eradicating any and all resistance in their path. They were led by a man in black armored robes with a silver-bladed lightsaber in his right hand. Revan was clearing the path of the troopers he was leading with torrents of lightning, frying the Imperial soldiers unfortunate enough to stand between him and his wife. A Sith warrior met the general, crimson and silver blades dancing in a shower of sparks. The Sith was promptly flanked by Republic soldiers and shot to pieces, while his blade and force powers were neutralized by Ichigo. Kurosaki jumped over the smoking corpse and continued forward, the few Sith standing in his way, dying without slowing him down. Soon the Jedi reached a barricaded stairway, its dura-steel door welded shut. He cut a circular hole in it and used the force to dislodge the assorted furniture used as a makeshift barricade which was blocking his path. Ichigo made his way down, emerging into the Room of Thousand Fountains. He cursed, seeing what was left from the heart of the Jedi Order. 19 Jedi were still on their feet, standing proud and protecting 24 Republic commandos by deflecting Sith blaster bolts. The knights were led by Rukia, who looked like a warrior goddess of old. She was fine. Ichigo released his breath with relief. During the last few days, the force was so turbulent that he could not say for sure how his wife and Bastard were faring, despite the strong force bonds he had with the two women. The soldiers escorting the general promptly went forward, lessening the pressure on their comrades. Ichigo made his way to Rukia, taking position to her right, his blade weaving an impregnable barrier. "You are late. Our guests are just dying to meet you." His wife deadpanned, glancing at him with a hint of a smile. "You know, being late is all the rage nowadays." Ichigo joked in kind. Nothing like a bit of humor to keep you sane on the battlefield. High above the husband and wife, the Coruscant defense fleet died well. Outnumbered, outgunned, and caught by surprise, they fought like lions. Keeping in formation, despite mounting losses, the Republic ships had rallied around 2 defensive platforms. It took 9 hours of constant combat for the Sith to win, the Coruscant fleet dragging a fifth of their enemies to hell with them. It was a great tactical victory for the Empire, made bitter by the loss of the 90% of ground forces. However painful, it was a survivable blow, deemed acceptable for the control of the Republic's capital. But what followed was not. Ichigo's gambit was successful, the minefields keeping the 5 fleets at Coruscant 4 months' travel from the nearest important Republic world, taking them out of the war for that time. The expected Republic counterattack to retake the capital never materialized. Instead, Revan, with his secret fleets, led a counter-offensive against all critical Empire shipyards, crippling or outright destroying them. These surgical strikes weighted the balance even heavier in the Republic's favor. The expected fracture after the fall of Coruscant never happened, with the people's fears dampened by a string of Republic victories on all fronts. That was possible by the general's decision to form up all the ships used for the mine-laying operation and send them to reinforce the various critical battles fought at that time. Flashback end. Shared mindscape. Rukia's legs felt weak as the vision ended. She would have crashed to the ground if not for Ichigo's hand steadying her. In all her years as Shinigami, she never saw such vicious combat. The Kuchiki heiress didn't want to think about the scale of the Republic-Sith war. It was mind-blowing, with constant battles on thousands of planets across the galaxy. A volume difficult to truly comprehend for people who did not possess the means to travel across the stars. Then it hit her. The woman in the vision was the one from her dreams. And Ichigo. He smiled gently and nodded. Ichigo Kurosaki, also known as Revan, ex-Republic general and a Knight of the Force, at your service, fair lady, he exclaimed with a bow. The declaration earned him a small fist to the top of his head and an order from indignant Rukia. Explain from the beginning. Now. In the beginning there was light. Ichigo was interrupted by growling, which would have made a small tigress proud. Yup, he still could get a rise out of her. Fine, no sense of humor left. Revan managed to catch her fist before she bonked him over the head for second time. He started again. After I had that unpleasant misunderstanding with your brother and that pineapple-headed imbecile, I lost my Shinigami powers. Our not-too-friendly mad scientist threw me into the shattered shaft. There my reincarnation kicked in high gear, and I started remembering bits and pieces. Got my connection with the Force restored too. However, if you ask me how we ended with the souls and my case full package from people in the Republic, I have no idea. Hell, I'm not even sure if the Republic exists in this dimension. Rukia listened to the explanation with raised eyebrow. Considering her dreams, it made some twisted kind of sense. Or she had gone insane. You are aware that I might have your wife's soul, but I am not her, right? Rukia asked, concerned. The last things they needed was Ichigo with even more delusions. Yeah, I know, he said quietly. Rukia could see the pain in his eyes at the confirmation, as if he just admitted the truth to himself. She placed a hand on his shoulder and squeezed it gently in support. I'm sorry, she muttered. They stayed that way for some time, deep in thought, never noticing how the room they were in started to vanish. Rukia felt a pulling sensation and blinked in surprise. She was back in her cell, just awakening. Was that another dream? She concentrated and motioned at an empty jug of water which was on the other side of the room. The new energy, this force was singing through her veins, enveloping her whole world. The jug slowly lifted and, tumbling through the air, made its way to her outstretched hand. She grabbed the objects, her eyes widening in wonder. Outside was already close to midnight. Hidden training ground, same time. Ichigo awoke, looking around wildly. He found himself placed in a hot spring, the bubbling water soothing his crippled hand. He saw a purple-haired woman whose skin had the color of cocoa with milk, chatting with Retsu. He sat up, groaning. Ladies, I hope you didn't take advantage of me. Ichigo chuckled quietly. The purple head smirked and asked, Tisk, tisk. Would we do that? She struck a sexy pose and battled her eyelashes at him. Ichigo raised an eyebrow, unperturbed. Who can resist to that? He waved at his body while smirking. Besides, I'm not some clueless kid who's easily embarrassed. Ichigo smirked. However, if you decide to put up a show, I have nothing against it. I'm a red-blooded male, after all. I hope we haven't irritated Captain Unohana. We haven't, right? Kurosaki asked with concern written all over his face. Yoruichi chuckled and slipped out of her clothes in a sensual motion which would have caused a cardiac arrest to weak-hearted man. She joining him in the water, her exquisite form gliding next to him. He didn't even bat an eyebrow at the sight. She had a body to die for. But as Revan, and as the Jedi Knight Kurosaki too, he hadn't been exactly celibate. He smirked at the thought. No, he hadn't been a model Jedi or Sith. Ichigo looked at the naked woman who was soaking next to him and smiled. Her antics had succeeded in preventing him from falling victim to his gloom thoughts. He had acted as an arrogant Padawan and got his ass handed to himself. The Reiatsu used in this world and the people wielding it were formidable, in many cases much more powerful than the most Jedi and Sith that he knew of old. The main reason for his success so far was his enormous spiritual pressure and the surprise his force powers were. And when that failed him, Ichigo looked at his maimed hand. That hollow power, the Zero, was an act of desperation. Against Zaraki, Revan had reached his limit as a force user and was found waning. Granted, he was not as powerful as he was in the Republic. The force here was raw, harder to tame and use. He knew what he had to do. Yoruichi, when my hand heals, I need you to train me in the Shinigami arts. Please, he asked, giving her a curt nod. She was just about to say something. Her lips were stretched in a small, mischievous smile. The shape-shifting woman was taken aback at the request. She was intending to suggest the same thing, but was afraid that after the prowess Ichigo had shown, he'd refuse. Whatever they were, his powers were amazing. But still, he had not faced the true strength of Seraite. Kenpachi had been playing with Kurosaki, testing him and deciding if he could be a great future sparring buddy. If Zaraki was serious from the beginning, not to mention that the captain of the 11th was the only one to achieve such a rank without having even a Shikai. The man was a monster with only a fraction of his potential power unlocked so far. She trembled at the thought of Zaraki with a Shikai or, God forbid, Bankai. She looked at Ichigo, noticing weariness in his eyes, the type she had seen in veterans who had fought too hard for too long. He was nearing his limits. She smiled softly and gave him a gentle nod. Yes, I will. And with Retsu's help, your hand will be as good as new in no time. The captain of the 4th interjected with her face adorned by one of her creepy smiles. That is so. However, Kurosaki-san, it will better if in the future you refrain from making such a mess from yourself. Ichigo was nodding frantically at that. Yoruichi giggled at the display. Oh, Retsu, you still got it. Ichigo drifted in a healing trance with her laughter chiming in his ears. Next morning, he had regained the use of his hand thanks to combination of the hot spring's restorative properties, Captain Unohana's skills, and his Jedi healing techniques. He had ended explaining her how healing through the Force works for half the night. To her eternal regret, Retsu had turned out to be blind to the Force. That day and night, Ichigo was trained by the purple-haired Fury in Hakudo, Kido, and Shunpo. To her pleasant surprise, Ichigo's Mandalorian close combat style had held well against her greater speed and experience. Revan had shown a surprising proficiency for Kido spells, and was determined to find ways of enchanting them with the Force. That, however, would have to wait for another time. Messing with the Shinigami spells while still learning was a bad idea, something both teacher and student agreed wholeheartedly. As far as the Shunpo was concerned, Ichigo had excelled. Yoruichi needed to show him few of the tricks, and then he had ran with it, adding the Jedi speed techniques to the mix. Still, when using pure Shunpo, he was not amongst the fastest. His body needed much more training to keep with such speeds without tearing itself apart. They had talked about Bankai training, but agreed that even with her shortcut, Rukia may not have 3 more days, so that was left for when the girl was safe. Interlude Hueco Mundo. A purple-haired girl was sitting on a high dune in the desert, looking lost. She knew that this place of endless white sand was not her home, yet she could not remember where or what it was. She gave up on trying to remember. Her blue eyes were looking around, hoping to find something interesting. She was idly drawing lines in the sand, bored. Behind her to the left, something crashed in one of the countless dunes. The impact sent a plume of dust and sand in the air, the sound of the strike echoing through the night. The woman perked up and jumped to her feet. Finally, something happened. She ran to the cloud of dust with piqued curiosity. The young woman found what had caused the commotion, the twisted, broken form of a bear-like hollow. It was covered with cuts, with his white pelt singed and tufts of fur missing. A buzzing sound announced the arrival of a newcomer. He was a man in white hakama, with light blue hair. His eyes were the same color, but also had green marking under them. He had a feral look to him, which was only enhanced by the bone mask fragment on the right side of his face. He looked at her smaller form and sniffed at her. According to his nose, she had the sweet, enticing smell of another big cat, mixed with something wild and unknown. "What do we have here, woman?" he asked. "I was bored," she muttered, examining him. "I came to see if this would prove to be interesting." "You know what they say about curiosity and little kittens?" He smirked. "You are not the one to talk." She huffed. He looked at her with critical eyes and smiled madly. "You say you wanted some excitement to deal with boredom? So do I. I'm Grimjow Yeager-Yaquez. You should to know the name of the man who is going to kick you, pretty ass." "Men," the woman sniffed derisively. She heard the buzzing sound again, and Grimjow was in front of her, his right fist flying at her face. The young woman turned her head to the left. The fist passed a hair-breadth from her cheek. She retaliated the old-fashioned way. Her right knee impacted between the blue-haired man's legs with enough strength to lift him off the ground. Yeager-Yaquez's eyes became wide as saucers, and small whimper slipped through his clenched teeth. "That's it, I'll kill ya," he hissed as an infuriated cat. Grimjow pounced at the offending woman. They became a whirlwind of punches and kicks. The nameless woman was forced to fall back under the superior speed and strength of the madman. 1 in 4 of his attacks were slipping through her guards, leaving her battered and bruised. She had just blocked an elbow strike at her face when Grimjow, in a display of even greater speed, turned his body to the side and delivered a kick in her gut. She flew, thrown off her feet, and ended half embedded in a dune. She extracted herself from the white sands, snarling. Her eyes had become yellow vertical slits. She stomped with her right leg, and a shockwave blew a line in the sand, heading straight at the charging blue-haired man. He jumped over it and walked right into a purple Kero. He deflected the attack with the back of his left hand, the beam of energy reflecting from his hierro and blowing up a nearby sandhill. "I'm Espada. You'll need much more to deal with me," he shouted with excitement. This woman had spunk. Grimjow jumped at her and threw her back after they exchanged a flurry of blows. She spat a mouthful of blood from a bitten tongue and snarled a warning animalistic sound. Electricity covered her hands as the infuriating man dashed at her again. He was met by a torrent of purple lightning. His hero turned out to be of no use against this attack, which danced all over his skin. Grimjow howled in pain as the electric storm picked up his body and threw him away as a broken toy. He found himself in a twitching, smoking heap. While his steel skin was still intact, he could feel the damage the attack had caused to his insides. Luckily, they were already healing. He stood up and drew Pantera. Hega Yaquez moved, leaving swirling sand in his wake. He appeared behind the woman, who was panting on her knees. Their eyes meet, azure orbs looking at deep blue pools. His sword arched forward, turning in the last moment to strike her on the head with the flat of the blade. The sound of metal hitting bone carried over the silent desert. Grimjow added another blow, this time with the pommel of his Zanpakuto. He had no intention of getting his family jewels smashed in again. With a happy grin, he picked up the unconscious woman. He had found someone interesting for his boss. After all, that's why he was out here right now, to find new recruits, read conscripts for Aizen's army. Grimjow vanished with his prize in a buzz of sonido. Senzaikyu, Siraite. Early in the morning, hours before sunrise, Ichigo could be found near Rukia's prison. Her cell was near the top of the White Tower, with a stone bridge leading to its door. The path was blocked by two captains, Byakuya Kuchiki and Sajin Komamura, and a squad of rank-and-file Shinigami. Ichigo looked over his target, his senses geared to maximum. He could feel his friends fighting a pair of captains. Luckily for him, Chad was against Kyoraku, so he was not worried for his life. Ishida and Inoue, however, were dealing with a man from whom Revan could sense cruelty and madness, and he could sense the Quincy weakening. He cursed and vanished, leaving Rukia rescue for later. 7. Chapter 7. In the Shadow of a Dark Lord. In the Shadow of a Dark Lord. Disclaimer: I do not own Bleach and Star Wars. They belong to their respective owners. This story was proofread by Zanthraxone. Zanpakuto. Thoughts: Zanpakuto. Speech: near the stairs leading to the Shishinro Seireitai. Ichigo looked over a scene of devastation. The pavement, which had been covering a long street, which was leading to the center of Soul Society, was torn asunder. It was like a giant blade had cleaved the middle of the road and shattered the nearby buildings, sending pieces of masonry in all directions. He could also sense the lingering traces of a paralyzing poison, clinging like a miasma to a lot of the debris. The only living sign in the vicinity of the battlefield was about 100 meters downwards from Kurosaki's current position. He flashed to it and found a battered young woman lying on her side. She was barely conscious and not entirely coherent, but in no danger of dying anytime soon. It was the simplest thing for the ex-Jedi to stretch through the Force and touch the woman's consciousness. For a brief moment, he glided over an ocean of confused thoughts, and then his psychic probe penetrated the weakened natural defenses the female had around her mind. In a kaleidoscope of distorted images, he experienced the battle between the captain of the 12th Mayuri Kurotsuchi and Ishida. The Quincy had won against one of the most powerful Soul Reapers in Seireitai, but he had paid the price in full. From what the woman, Nemu, had witnessed, Uryu had fought valiantly, only to end little more than a mobile corpse, able to move only thanks to a technique of his. The silver lining was that Orihime had listened to Ishida and ran away, and Ichigo could not sense any immediate danger for the bubbly girl. That was something that could not be said about the Caped Avenger. Kurosaki felt a pull in the Force and bolted up the hill. The Force user had the premonition that Ishida was about to run into another captain. The poor bastard can't get a break. Seconds later, Ichigo appeared over the Quincy, who was lying unconscious at the entrance of a small courtyard. On the other side of the open space was a dark-skinned man with purple hair. He was wearing white, transparent goggles over his sightless eyes. That was Kaname Tosen, one of Aizen's most likely co-conspirators. If not for the insensate body of the Quincy, that would have been a perfect opportunity for the general. Well, improvisation it is, again, he thought. The captain stared at the newcomer. He could see the spirit power enveloping the man, which was like a cloak billowing in a hurricane winds. The reiatsu of the ryoka was grey in color, with tendrils of light and shadows dancing in its fringes, and that was something he had never seen. The aura of the man was peaceful, yet he could almost smell the stench of blood from 1,000 battlefields on his new opponent. So that's Ichigo Kurosaki. Aizen couldn't be more wrong about this so-called boy. Konami felt it in his bones. This was no mere teen to be evaluated for possible potential, neither an amusing experiment. In a moment of revelation, Tosen felt that he knew what he was facing, and that was anathema as far as his chosen path was concerned. So you are one of Aizen's little minions. Be a good Shinigami and tell me what is your master planning, and why you betrayed your comrades. A subtle suggestion through the force, a long shot really. My eyes can only see one path, and that is the path with the least amount of bloodshed. I want the strength to help me create peace. And that is something only Aizen-sama can grant me. It is not enough to believe in justice in this wretched world, so I will become justice. I will seek out the evils in this world and wipe them out like the clouds in the sky. I swear I will purge Ser Aitai for justice. Well, that worked better than expected. Score 1 for the Shinigami's tendency to gloat and rant during combat. Ichigo smirked. His amusement was brief. The tone with which the captain was speaking and the way he felt through the force, it was maddening. Just like the old Jedi Council on Coruscant at the beginning of the Mandalorian Wars. Funny, every time I hear something like that, people are dying. For the greater good, least bloodshed, or because not all angles of the situation are considered. And never the people saying those slogans are the ones expected to do the dying. It is easy to play the saint with pure spirit when you live in heaven. Ichigo glared at the blind man and fought a tide of memories which tried to flash to the front of his mind. He knew it was not precisely fair to the man to compare him with the Jedi Council and later the Chancellor of the Republic, but he felt similar, a fanatic blind to anything beside his point of view, as well as a dangerous one at that. Konami gripped the orange hilt of his Zanpakuto and drew it. Naka. The Shinigami muttered the release command of his Shikai. Ichigo raised an eyebrow when a wave of high-pitched sound slammed into him and drifted over a light force shield. That was a technique to protect oneself against sound assault. He had created it after Malak betrayed him in answer to the ridiculous amount of sound-based weapons and grenades he had to face on Manan. By the time he led the assault to recapture the secret Republic base on the ocean floor, he had perfected the skill, making it a passive defense, which he was maintaining unconsciously all the time he was awake. Who would have thought that it would be useful against a Shinigami? Kurosaki Flash stepped in front of his new opponent. The hum of his activated lightsaber was the only warning Konami received before a silver blade nearly took off his left arm. Ichigo held his weapon in one-handed duelist stance, similar to a style of lightsaber combat that would be made infamous in another dimension by a man called Count Dooku. Ichigo entangled Konami's blade with his own while gathering dark wisps of force in his left hand. He made a pushing motion with his palm and a twitching, almost alive ball of dark tentacles, only visible to one attuned to the force, impacted the captain's chest. Konami spasmed and stumbled. Only reflexes honed for over a century gave him a chance when a blade made from silver light headed to his neck. Tosen parried the attack, which despite being no stronger than the previous he had parried, almost tore his Zanpakuto out of his arms. He coughed a glob of blood and hastily stepped back. The Shinigami could barely sense a foreign energy coursing through his being, which was weakening him like the insidious disease it emulated. With a wordless scream, he enveloped himself into a pillar of Reiatsu, in attempt to purge, or at least keep at bay, whatever Kurosaki had done to him. The small strands of dark side energy poisoning him were drowned by the spiritual power, giving relief to the panting Shinigami. For a brief moment, Konami knew how Ukitake had felt on a bad day with his disease. In the short amount of time the captain needed to deal with that attack, Ichigo streaked at him. Their swords met, and the Soul Reaper's Zanpakuto was turned to the side. Revan spun in place, and the back of his left armored glove impacted Tosen's left temple. The power of the strike sent the captain stumbling to the ground. Konami's goggles flew from his face, dislodged by the impact. Before he hit the ground, Tosen sent a Byakurai, pale lightning, without incantation at Ichigo. The blue beam of electricity hit Revan's lightsaber. The lightning bolt cracked quietly and danced harmlessly over the energy blade. While it did not hurt Kurosaki, the counterattack gave Tosen enough time to recover. Bakudo Nin, Geki, strike. Kanami shouted another Kido without incantation. Ichigo was engulfed by red light and paralyzed for a moment. The general cursed silently in Hutese, Suzumushi, Nishiki, Benihiko. Cricket's second movement, crimson flying locusts. The captain's Zanpakuto vibrated, and he moved it in a semicircle with Ichigo in the center of it. It looked as if a trail was drawn in the air. Split second later, it turned into hundreds of blades which hurled themselves at the substitute Shinigami. Enkosen, Arc Shield. Ichigo managed to hiss the name of a Bakudo spell. The blades hit with the force of a broadside and shattered the ground where Kurosaki was staying, still paralyzed. Kanami's sight was obscured by the explosion of Reiatsu made by his own attack. And so it ends, Ichigo Kurosaki. You shall not move me from the path I've chosen. You'll need more than that. I've faced much worse, the general said quietly. The dust cleared, revealing Ichigo, who was holding a long black katana. He was clad in the distinctive form of dark-colored Mandalorian armor, which was dented in places where slowed-down blades had impacted him. In front of Revan, the shattered pieces of the Bakudo shield were dissolving into glowing moths of reishi. Despite his nonchalant outwards attitude, Ichigo's was pissed off. That attack had come too close to hurting him seriously again. The general knew that he needed more time to be truly ready for the realities of Soul Reaper combat. And that was one of things he lacked. I see, Kanami deadpanned. Let's finish this charade. Bankai. Tosen held up his Zanpakuto and placed his left palm against the ring on its crossguard. It began spinning madly and releasing an even increasing quantities of spiritual energy. It grew bigger and bigger until it surrounded the Shinigami. It split in 10 equal rings, which circled Tosen. With a slash of the blade, Kanami scattered them. They promptly formed a perimeter around a large area. A black void split from them as if the circles were portals to another realm. It spewed black tendrils of energy into a dark dome which swallowed the combatants. Ichigo was plunged into darkness, an endless void which made his senses of sight, scent, and Reiatsu useless. Even if you try to guess my position from where I attack, you will not be able to catch me. No matter how experienced a fighter is, after he is stripped of light, he can't help but fear the darkness. No matter how slight that fear is, the fighter's movements will be slowed down, Kanami explained. His voice was coming from everywhere, making it impossible to locate him that way. A light chuckle answered him. It transformed in full-blown laughter, which sounded sinister as if twisted by the shadows. Rukia's cell, same time. If the circumstances were somewhat different, Ichigo's brush with the dark side wouldn't have had such unexpected consequences. He should have been able to shield his bond with Rukia from the darkness. However, that was not the case, and Rukia did not have the time and complete memories needed to rebuild the shields that once protected her mind. To make things worse, the imprisoned woman was a Shinigami, a being for which it was normal to have another sentient spirit with its own personality in her mind, which made possible the existence of another all-too-real personalities within her, an unexpected side effect of the way her soul was sent to this plane of existence. At the precise moment when Ichigo drank deeply from the sickly sweet ocean of the dark side, the Force used his bond with Rukia and acted as a catalyst. In more normal circumstances, Rukia might have lived the rest of her life as the person who was born and raised in this dimension, despite some memories of a previous life and a connection with the Force. Such would have been the natural course of her fate. After all, for Ichigo to be actually reincarnated, it took him one perfect moment of balance between life and death, when the walls between past and present life were crumbling along with his mind as he was dying. The Force had other ideas. While incorporeal, it was a living, sentient thing. Yet in this reality, the Force was a newborn being. For all its power, it was vulnerable, fragile. It needed another primary conduit beside Ichigo in order to be safer. To feel safe, preferably one which is primary a Force user, and Rukia was the logical choice. The only choice when you think about it. The fact that her soul was now almost out of Reiryoku with the artifact buried within her, slowly turning her into a human, combined with her past life, made her the perfect candidate. So it acted. And for the Force, the so-called light and dark sides were mostly irrelevant. For Rukia, it was as if a supernova exploded into the depths of her mind, the barrier separating the Shinigami. Rukia Kuchiki from her past self shattered like a thin glass hit by a sledgehammer. For a brief heartbeat, all the personalities in her mindscape were manifesting as real as herself. On a frost-covered meadow, next to a frozen lake, a group of women met. The first one was a Shinigami heiress to a noble clan clad into the standard Soul Reaper uniform. This was the Rukia who had grown and lived in Soul Society for the last 150 years, the woman in whose mindscape the meeting was occurring. Next to her was standing a Jedi in snow-white robes who had a serene smile on her face. The third was an albino twin of the Shinigami, with silver hair and yellow eyes, who was watching the pair with surprise. And finally, the last of their little group, a woman in black robes whose crimson lips were turned into sinister smile. Her yellow eyes, similar yet different from Hollow's, were watching the other three with amusement. All around them, Rukia's mindscape was being flooded by the very essence of the dark side of the Force. You know, the voice of the Sith was soft and seductive. It is a rare thing for one such as me to speak about the will of the Force. That kind of talk is usually the domain of one such as her. She nodded at the Jedi, whose undivided attention was concentrated at the Dark Lady. Yet we find ourselves in interesting situation. The Force cries for us, the ones who has the ears to hear it. It screams for action. And even one such as me is unable to resist this call. She looked at Rukia the Shinigami. It is time to grow up, little girl. It is time to remember who you are. She met the Hollow's eyes, and something intangible passed between them. The Sith nodded in silent understanding. Do what you have to do. I'll entertain our other guest. The Hollow whispered in a voice which was distorted mockery of Rukia's own. The Jedi frowned at the words. The Force whispered a warning, and she moved in desperate attempt to evade an attack she did not see coming. The girl in white had a katana in her hands and was upon the Jedi in a blink of an eye. All the light side Force user could do was to evade the blur of a blade which was moving faster than her sight could follow. She made a long jump backwards and drew a lightsaber which was tucked in her robes. An emerald blade extended from the cylinder in her hands, and she met the next attack head-on. The moment the blades met, she felt the Force screaming at her. The Jedi looked behind her opponent and saw her dark counterpart turning into a dark mist and surrounding the Shinigami. Rukia was bewildered by the gathering in her mindscape. It was like watching a movie, seeing and hearing everything, but she was unable to act and change the events. Her body was like a puppet with its string cut. She was appalled to find a Sith and a bloody Hollow of all things. It really was no surprise that the corrupted spirit attacked what Rukia believed was a representation of her as a Jedi during her previous life. She tried to scream a warning, but her lips were sealed shut and her body was still like a granite statue. She watched with sick fascination the transformation of the Sith woman into a black mist, which slowly, as if taunting her helplessness, started to coil around the Shinigami. Rukia felt the touch of the dark, incorporeal substance on her skin. She knew that it should have revolted her, yet the shadows caressing her were familiar. The mist pulsed in tandem with the river of darkness leaking through the Force bond with Ichigo. It resonated with something which was ages ago buried deep into Rukia's heart. She was able to resist the sweet temptation of the shadows which were boring deep into her very soul for what felt like eternity. She balanced on a blade's edge between light and darkness. Then her heart was gripped by anguish which she had suppressed for far too long. The Sith knew how to manipulate Rukia. After all, she knew the Kuchiki's every secret. The Shinigami saw her hands being stained with Kayan's blood. Once again she felt him dying in her arms. She watched the bloody form of Ichigo lying on the ground as she was about to pass through the Senkaimon with her captors. There was the never-voiced resentment at Seraite for the fate which befell Ichigo because of the government's orders. All that was mixed with self-loathing. It was her fault when all was said and done. For a moment she felt fury, and that brief feeling was enough to betray her. Rukia's very being exploded with rage she had not felt for eons. A dragon, long forgotten, awoke within her heart. And Rukia felt herself failing as wave after wave of dark side energy poured into her very soul and twisted her mindscape into a dark reflection of itself. The soft snow became black and oily. The ice gripping the frozen lake turned into a dark crystal under which one could see a Jedi screaming soundlessly. And deep below the frosty waters was the bound and unconscious form of Sode no Shirayuki, who had no access to enough Reiatsu to stay conscious. "Shh, my dear, we are complete at last," the dark spirit whispered in Rukia's ears, who was frozen into a slowly cracking pillar of black ice. It crumbled into a shower of crystals, which revealed the form of the young Kuchiki. She opened her eyes. Her yellow Sith eyes widened in wonderment, and she smiled. "It's time to leave this sorry excuse for prison. I promised Ichigo that he'll not have to save me ever again." A telekinetic wave raced outward from the still form of Rukia's body. It slammed into the walls of her cell, and the force of the impact cracked the Reiatsu suppressing stone. The door was not so lucky. The invisible energy shattered its hinges, and it was ejected as a twisted piece of metal. Ichigo, who was cheerfully surfing on the thundering waves of the Force, smiled at his opponent. "All too true. Most people fear the darkness. It terrifies them. However, I know all about it. It is both my ally and my servant. If this is your Bankai ability, then I am the worst opponent you could have ever faced." The captain frowned and attacked. It was simple, easy. Just a slash at the arm to put this Ryoka into his place. Ichigo should have been helpless. A black katana met Tosen's Zanpakuto. Kurosaki had moved without hesitation. His head was turned towards Kaname, and the Shinigami could feel Ichigo's eyes boring into him. "How?" the captain almost shouted with surprise and jumped back. His features were twisted into a shocked expression. Tosen could feel the waves of amusement radiating from his opponent. Ichigo's Reiatsu shifted, and suddenly it was darker than moonless midnight. No traces of light remained in it. It made the substitute Shinigami hard to see into the Reiatsu-saturated dome. Even as a Jedi, this. Ichigo waved at their new surroundings. Would not have been a challenge. The Force is sense enough, but you are not that lucky. You, my dear captain, have critical information that I need. So for you, I'll have to wear another of my masks. If Kaname possessed sight to see, he could have watched how Ichigo's heavy armor moved like a living thing and transformed into the robes Revan had created with the technology of the Starforge. His eyes became sickly yellow, a fusion between the colors of a Sith and Hollow. So woe to you, Captain Tosen, for today you face a Sith Lord in a darkness of your own making. There are probably few dumber things to do. For example, you could cover yourself with gravy and start taunting a hungry rancor. Ichigo thought with amusement, which was short-lived. He had always hated the sweet, corrupting touch of the dark side. Its influence was subtle, making it easy to lose oneself in it and become a mindless, corrupted tool. Something he had learned how to avoid long time ago. That's what made him different from almost all the other so-called Sith who had come and gone before him and those not yet born. To be fair, such as him were rare. In all the millennia since the ancient schism between the Force users, few had discovered this secret. He was the 9th Knight of the Force, neither light or dark, for he was both Jedi and Sith, two sides of the same coin. It was his deep, dark secret, which only one woman knew. He never truly fell to the dark side. Ichigo was a Knight of the Force who merely exchanged masks. As he did right now, Kaname's unseeing eyes widened. Another void spilled into the dome. He winced and stepped back. A darkness of a different kind surrounded him and chilled him to the bones. The captain shuddered. A fine layer of frost started to form on his uniform. He instinctively recoiled as an incorporeal tendril of shadows brushed his right arm, numbing it with unnatural coldness. His face drained of blood as he started hearing unintelligible whispers. Tosen was about to drop out of his Bankai when his blood froze into his veins. He could no longer sense Kurosaki's Reiatsu. There was only the miasma of darkness all around him. A storm of dark blue, almost black lighting struck the captain. The command to his Zanpakuto spirit to cease the Bankai remained unfinished. Kanami screamed as he was engulfed by a cage of electricity and lifted in the air by the crackling energy. His sword clattered on the ground, released from spasming fingers. Tosen's clothes and flesh started smoking. The captain's mind was close to snapping, as every nerve ending in his body was overloaded by pain impulses at the same time. In a desperate effort to protect his sanity, he collected all the spirit power his wounded body could wield and compressed it as a shield over his body. The assault abated. The lighting arched over the captain and struck the ground below him, dealing much less damage. The storm ended as suddenly as it began. One moment Kaname was suspended in the air. In the next he was on his knees, steadied by a hand grasping his left shoulder. A part of his mind, which was somewhat clearer, noticed how Ichigo kicked the Shinigami's Zanpakuto away. The sword bounced off the ground and disappeared in the dark. The last thing Tosen saw was the palm of Kurosaki's left hand, which was engulfed by crimson glow. Ichigo placed it on the captain's forehead, and Kaname was plunged into darkness. 8. Chapter 8. Dark Temptations. Dark Temptations. Disclaimer: I do not own Bleach and Star Wars. They belong to their respective owners. This story was proofread by Xanthrax Sone. Thank you. Zanpakuto. Thoughts. Zanpakuto. Speech. Rukia's cell, Shishinro Siraite, Soul Society's death row prison, was a bit different from its counterparts in the real world. Its main distinguishing feature was that the prisoners could not escape on their own. The reishi-absorbing stone from which the tower was built with made that impossible. For ages, the guard detail had to worry only for the unlikely occurrence of someone trying to break free the prisoners. That was the reason the 6 men who were guarding Rukia's cell were paying her no attention and had their backs turned to the door of her guest suite. As far as they were concerned, the Kuchiki heiress was harmless, while her powers were neutralized, and she was no more dangerous than an ordinary human. Pity they had no concept of how harmless a run-of-the-mill Force user could be. Rukia, however, was many things, but an ordinary Jedi or Sith. Koyako Himura was the 10th Seat officer of the 1st Division. He was the man currently in charge of the guard detail for the entire Shishinro. Considering that there was only one prisoner in the whole tower, despite her high profile, Himura's job was not what he had expected it to be. Despite the fact that this was deemed a very important assignment, after a few hours of cooling his heels under the scorching rays of the sun, the novelty of his current mission had worn off, and he and his 5 subordinates started cursing their luck. That was on the first day. By now, the only reason they were somewhat alert of their surroundings was because of the frequent visits of various captains, who were patrolling in a search for the intruders. Until a minute ago, Yushiro Ukitake and Byakuya Kuchiki were in the vicinity of the shrine, which ensured that the guards were more attentive than usual. However, their attention was focused in the wrong direction. When a wave of power manifested in the cell behind them, they were caught off guard. The only one able to react was Himura. He managed to turn around in time to see how the door of the cell was blasted off its hinges. Koyako's youngest subordinate, Asano Meno, a kid who was only a year out of the academy, was the unlucky bastard who became the 2nd Shinigami, whose death was caused by Rukia. He happened to be in front of the door when it was turned into an impromptu projectile by a force wave emanated from their prisoner's body. The twisted piece of metal struck the guard in the small of his back, with a force rivaling a speeding bus. It cracked multiple vertebrae and threw him like a boneless rag doll. Asano flew forward and hit the parapet of the bridge leading to the cell hard, shattering his right shoulder. He bounced off the hard stone and fell in the abbeys between the shrine and the only hill in Seraite. The sudden shock and damage caused by the unexpected attack were too much for Meno, who was unable to even scream as he plunged to his death. Himura froze for a moment. Just like that, the kid was snuffed out of existence. A small part of his brain screamed at him that this was impossible. The Kuchiki girl should not have been able to use Reiatsu at all. The fact that he had not felt spiritual power during this attack had not registered yet. He had no more time to ponder what the hell was happening because he heard a laughter coming from the cell. It was glorious. The sense of the cool floor on which she was laying, the light cramping in her muscles, even the stale air she was breathing. She was alive. Rukia smiled and stretched, enjoying the feelings of her muscles moving under her skin. She stood up and laughed in delight when she felt the force. It was wild, untamed. It was in a state that suited a Sith like her just fine. "Hi, boys," Rukia exclaimed and turned to the entrance of her temporary residence. Two men in white, almost grey uniforms entered the room. Their faces were hidden by veils of all things. The only feature visible were their eyes, which were glaring at her lithe form. They were armed with long polearms, which had a metal, horn-like weapon fitted on the wooden shafts. Dull weapons at that, probably made for subduing prisoners and dealing with crowds. Rukia's smile became wider and cheerful. It has been a long time since she had real fun in battle. For the Shinigami she used to be, combat was a duty, not something to revel in. She pitied that poor girl. The first pair of guards moved towards her, freeing the entrance for another duo to enter. Behind them, their leader was drawing his sword. Their plan was to subdue the prisoner fast before she could pull another stunt, and to extract a pound of flesh for their murdered comrade. The two men closest to Rukia slung their weapons and charged her. The reborn Lady of the Sith made a grasping motion with her hands, and her attackers were stopped in their tracks. They were suspended in mid-air and felt like giant fists were squeezing the life out of them. Rukia winked at the unfortunate Shinigami and made a pushing motion with her hands. They were thrown away and hit the walls surrounding the doorframe with enough force to be embedded in the cracked stone, sending pieces of shattered masonry in all directions. Her smile widened as she felt the tingle of fear appearing in the hearts of the remaining men. "Come on, that can't be all you've got. You are big, bad Shinigami, right?" she taunted. "Get that bitch," Himura growled. His two remaining subordinates charged the mad woman, and he moved a step behind them. "Good." Rukia smiled and opened herself for the sweet taint of the dark side. The power that invaded her veins was like a liquid fire. It made her shudder in anticipation for more death and devastation. She sidestepped to the left, positioning herself so that the rightmost Shinigami acted as a shield between her and the other two. Her left hand shot forward and grabbed the shaft of the polearm with which her closest opponent was armed. With the force coursing through her veins and steeling her muscles, she was powerful enough to hold the man's weapon at bay. He tried to make it a contest of strength, a logical choice on his part, as he was a head taller and much broader than the smaller woman. The shock and fear he felt when he was unable to overpower her was sweet ambrosia to Rukia. Electricity cracked in the palm of her right hand. She then pointed it towards the man's chest. The last thing his terror-filled eyes saw was a cracking sphere of energy held at bay by her fist. A loud crack resounded in the confined cell, nearly deafening the still-alive Shinigami. The man whose weapon Rukia was holding never saw the beam of electricity which impaled him and vaporized his heart. There was just a brief flash and sense of heat. His brain was already dead when his blood boiled in his veins. With a wave of her free hand, the Sith discarded her latest victim, like a little girl who throws away a doll during a temper tantrum. She grinned and pointed her right arm at the two remaining men. Her hand was holding an arching lightning bolt which in front of their eyes compressed in a long energy blade with the color of blood. Rukia giggled at their fear and charged. The last man with a pole arm tried to parry a vertical slash with his weapon, but the shaft provided no resistance to the energy blade. It cleaved through the wood as if it was butter and bisected the Shinigami from the top of his head to his belly. Without looking, Rukia stepped back and avoided horizontal slash by Koyako. Homura glared at the woman who just wiped out his squad like they were nothing. What he saw in her yellow eyes made it even worse. There was not a shred of remorse or regret. She enjoyed murdering them. He could feel it in his bones. And now he was left alone to stop her. He shivered as he looked at her face. That smile gave him the creeps. It was one fit for an apex predator which was bored and wanted to play with its prey. "What are you?" Koyako asked. He cursed his voice, which was barely a whisper. "Do you fear me, Shinigami?" Rukia smirked. She entered Makashi's stance, moving with an unrivaled grace. The form looked like it was tailor-made for her. "I am many things, little man," she said. "Yeah, you're an insane, murderous bitch." "You've got a bit of spunk left," she exclaimed cheerfully. "Oh yes? Fear mixed with anger and hatred, and spiced with determination to face me anyway. This one might be fun. Rukia moved with a flourish. Her lithe form was supercharged with force energies. Her blade sang its bloodthirsty song and lunged forward, aiming for Homura's heart. At first, Koyako held his ground, deflecting a flurry of light strikes, which purpose was to test his abilities. This continued for a few seconds, and then suddenly Rukia's speed increased dramatically. He had to fall back to the door, trading ground for few more precious seconds in which the crimson blade was kept away from his flesh. Surprise could be seen in the man's eyes. I've been training for too many hours with the lieutenant who uses similar fighting style when in Shikai. I should be able to hold my own for more that few seconds. The Shinigami thought. Rukia frowned at her opponent. She hoped for a real challenge, not this pathetic excuse for a swordsman. That won't do at all. She extended her will over the force and pulled the unlucky man towards her. Rukia moved a step forward and swatted the flying man's Zanpakuto away, so Homura stumbled in a perfect position for her to kneel him in the groin. As Koyako fell to his knees with a moan which left him defenseless. A flash of crimson later, Homura's head was separated from his body. With her last kill, Rukia felt a sliver of energy detaching from the decapitated corpse and merging with her being. She grinned cheerfully and cloaked herself with the force, becoming invisible. She had not enough Reiatsu left in her body to be detected from anything more than few paces, so that was not a concern. The reinforcements who arrived minute later found only the carnage Rukia left in her wake, with no sign of the escaped prisoner. Unknown place. Well, that's unexpected. Ichigo looked around with surprise written all over his mask-covered face. He was about to start tearing into the memories of the disabled captain, and then he was here, in the shadows of tall trees on the floor of a forest. It was something which in a dozen or so millennia could become something similar to the Wookiees' homeworld. It was only missing the various things that would cheerfully murder and eat you to make the impression even closer. What was that saying that many of the natives of this world were so fond of? You are not in Kansas anymore? You should not be here. A tall woman in dark green kimono, which was decorated with flowers Ichigo did not recognize, she appeared from thin air to his right. Her face was hidden by a veil in lighter shade of the same color. So I gather. Kuroasuke answered her statement. From what little he knew about a Shinigami's mindscape, he should not be able to come to this place. Yet here he was, straight in what Ichigo believed to be Tosen's mind. Strike one for unexpected consequences. They were interrupted by an almighty crash. The battered form that was Tosen literally fell from the sky. The captain's body broke through a centuries-old tree and impacted the ground with enough force to make a meter-deep crater. While watching the spectacle, Ichigo had to use the force to shield himself and the unnamed woman from a rain of splinters produced by the tree, stones, and other small debris thrown from Kanami's impact with the ground. That's got to hurt, Ichigo muttered. Good, said the woman. Revan raised an eyebrow. He could feel no love lost between those two. He walked up to Tosen, who was stunned from his crash landing while keeping an eye on the woman. His forward progress was promptly terminated when a crimson pillar made of lightning struck the unconscious captain and blew away Ichigo and the female. The force user tumbled through the air a few times before managing to stabilize his flight and stop a couple of meters over the ground. He hovered by subconsciously channeling Reiatsu to the soles of his feet. Revan looked up and winced. Oh. The sky was being torn asunder by a giant vortex with the color of fresh blood. It looked like a vast storm, as you would watch from orbit. Wild lightning bolts were dancing on the edges of the phenomena. They were creating the illusion that the tear in the captain's mindscape was contained by a net of energy. This, however, couldn't be farther than the truth. This was only a harbinger of things to come. Ichigo absent-mindedly admired the effect of which his technique had upon the mindscape of his victim. Under different circumstances, he would have appreciated the opportunity to study the effects of the mind rend from such a perspective. While it was great to delve deep into the mysteries of the Force, such pursuits usually required that the immediate area to be free from pissed-off Zanpakuto spirits and other distractions, like the woman in green who shunpoed behind Ichigo and tried to cut off his head. That was also the first thing to go wrong for him that day, as almost all of the force power he could channel was concentrated in the Mind Rend, which was shattering Tosen's mind defenses and leeching Kaname's memories. So he was left to rely primarily on his Reiatsu against a Captain Zanpakuto. Time to put my new training to the test. Revan rolled forward, evading the katana's blade. Reiatsu coated his left hand, which glowed as he grabbed fistful of air, as it was a tangible substance. This action allowed him to stop his forward momentum and catapult himself at the woman who was charging at him. Kurosaki's right hand had retrieved his lightsaber, and the red blade extended from the curved hilt of his weapon. This maneuver surprised the spirit and bought Ichigo an extra half-second. He then parried the katana of his newest opponent mid-swing and crashed into the woman. What followed was too fast for even a Jedi or Sith to recall. He fell back on his years of training and left his body move the way it was conditioned to act in such circumstances. A flurry of blows and kicks, later they separated. In the brief encounter, the woman had lost her sword, and it was laying on the ground below them. Same was true for Ichigo, but an absent-minded gesture later, the curved cylinder that was his lightsaber flew to his outstretched hand. The opponents took a short reprieve to examine the damage they had suffered during the brief but brutal close combat. Revan's pinky finger on his left hand was twisted in an unnatural angle, and he could feel the break in a couple of bones in that palm. The woman had lost her veil, revealing her face. She had short curly hair with the color of oak bark. Her oval face was marred by bruises and the blood leaking from her broken nose and lips. Her green oval eyes were hard with determination. She waved her hands, and 2 rows of blades formed in front of her. She made a throwing gesture, and the blades of metal were hurled at Revan. He dodged using Shunpo and left the projectiles to savage the forest floor. However, that was just a taste of what followed, a real steel rain which he was hard-pressed to evade. "Ye Lord, mask of blood and flesh!" Revan spoke calmly, as if discussing something of no importance that had occurred on a backwater world in the Outer Rim, despite the entire ordnance coming his way. "All creation, flutter of wings." He ducked behind the bulk of an ancient tree. "Ye who bears the name of man, inferno and pandemonium." His respite was short-lived. Ichigo's cover lasted 2 seconds before a 4-meter-tall segment of the tree was reduced to splinters. The rest of the giant plant toppled with a groan of splintering bark. "The sea barrier surges, march on to the south." He finished the incantation and Flash stepped above the woman. "Shakaho!" red fire cannon. He shouted, channeling enough Reiatsu into the Kido spell to strain the limit of how much energy it could contain. A ball of red energy shot from his open palm and screamed at the woman who tried to evade with Shunpo. Instead, she stumbled as a Bakudo #1 Sai, restrain, cast without incantation, bound her hands behind her back. The binding spell shattered almost as soon as it was cast, but that was more than enough of a delay. The explosion that followed would have evaporated most living beings, which were familiar to Revan. The detonation rivaled that of multiple plasma grenades. Yet the woman was made of tougher stuff. She was burned and bleeding, with myriad of internal injuries which were ravaging her body with even more pain, but despite all that, she was standing in the center of the deep crater made by the Kido. Her beaten form was half hidden by smoke, giving her a ghostly appearance. Ichigo locked eyes with the woman, admiring her resilience for a brief moment. An unspoken understanding passed between them, from one warrior to another. Then Revan pointed his index and middle fingers of his left hand at her. "Byakurai, pale lightning." The energy bolt Ichigo fired at the woman never reached its target. It was shattered by a powerful lighting bolt 100 times more powerful than his Byakurai that struck from the vortex in the sky. It was meters across and hit the ground with the power of orbital strike. Revan and the woman were thrown in different directions by the blast wave created by the hit. Kurosaki tumbled through the air like a leaf picked up by a hurricane. He was half-stunned and disoriented, so it is no surprise that he was unable to halt his flight before crashing in the corona of an old tree. His momentum was slowed down by impacts in many branches, which broke like twigs when struck by his body. He was finally stopped after a hard landing when he hit the vast roots of an elder tree. What followed was a strange experience. Revan was encased in a pillar of crimson light. He felt the same happening to the woman kilometers away. Around him, monstrous bolts of lightning were shattering trees into burning cinders and rending the ground asunder. Far above the trio of beings, encased by the pillars, the vortex in the sky had doubled in size and range. From the hungry maw that was the center of the rift, a sparkling beam of purple light struck each pillar. Revan's perspective suddenly changed. He was looking at the burning forest from farther and farther away. The sight of the devastated landscape was vanishing fast. Seconds later, he was enveloped by red haze, and Tosen's mindscape disappeared from sight. Ichigo was soon dropped in a black abyss where he floated for moments, minutes, or was it hours? It was similar to the embrace of the dark side, yet he was at peace. His unexpected rest was ended by a bombardment of distorted images and feelings without context. Frozen pictures of a much younger Tosen practicing with a wooden katana. The form of a girl laid to rest into a coffin filled with flowers. Sadness, despair, determination, a strong desire for justice. A twisted, almost impossible to understand image of a forest, clearing on which many Shinigami were laying. A blonde-haired man wearing Captain's haori, screaming as a white bone-like substance spreads over his face. Unwavering loyalty towards Aizen. Without a warning, Ichigo could feel how the source of the visions and feelings shifted. A pleased, merry laughter of a happy woman. Sense of profound pride when Tosen was able to achieve Bankai. The joy when Kanami pronounced the release phrase for the first time. That was when Revan understood the basis of the connection between Shinigami and their Zanpakuto. He could feel now how the woman felt towards her wielder. It was love, vast and unconditional. Then it happened. A command Ichigo could not hear, which was reluctantly obeyed. Disregard, abandonment, to be ignored by your wielder no matter how much you scream, and when you are an essential part of his very soul. Then there was a sense of a betrayal without equal. Yet he was unable to see what it was. Ichigo stretched through the force, searching for answers. The darkness receded, and he was face to face with the battered form of the woman. "Please tell me," Revan asked her with a soft voice. They locked eyes for a long moment. She nodded and started talking. Site of the battle between Revan and Tosen Kaname, Seiraite. The area claimed by Tosen's Bankai exploded outward in a rain of black reishi. In the center of the waterfall of disturbed spiritual particles, two figures could be seen. The one clad in black robes was holding with its left hand the head of a singed and smoking man, clad in burned captain's uniform, who was seemingly unconscious. That was the sight which greeted the various Shinigami who had come after the Bankai was released. Before any of them could react, Revan brought his deactivated lightsaber level with Tosen's chest. Ichigo's thumb pressed a button on his weapon's hilt, and a crimson blade extended from the cylinder in his right hand. A pillar of concentrated light burned through flesh and bone and emerged from the captain's back. A small movement of the wrist and Tosen's heart was cleaved in two by the energy blade. Ichigo released the man, and Kaname fell to his knees with his mouth opened and releasing faint wisp of smoke. The captain's face was forever frozen with an expression of shock. Kurosaki made a slash with his weapon, and dozens of shocked Shinigami watched with disbelief how Tosen's head rolled behind the captain's decapitated torso and bounced off the ground. "Thank you," a woman whispered. Few of the Soul Reapers who were not completely stunned by the sight of one of their best being executed saw how the figure of a woman in green kimono became corporeal behind Ichigo's left shoulder. This was the shocking sight that greeted Byakuya Kuchiki when he arrived. His eyes tightened when he looked at the corpse of his fellow captain. The boy who he crushed not so long ago, and the current one who had murdered a captain in front of him, couldn't be one and the same, right? Tisk, lover, I hope for your sake that you are not straying." A sensual, seductive voice shattered the silence which had descended upon the battlefield. The air couple of meter to the right of Ichigo blurred in the distinctive distortion of a thermo-optical camouflage shutting down. Rukia Kurosaki gazed at her husband and her face softened. Her yellow Sith eyes bled into deep blue, which was becoming purplish depending on how the light fell on her face. She smiled softly and, to Byakuya's eternal shock, she said in a strangely alluring foreign accent. "It's been eons, my love. It is good to lay my eyes upon you again." Revan removed his mask and looked at Rukia, his eyes drunk with the ethereal visage of his wife, his Sith wife. A small, wishful smile appeared on his face, while happiness and unmitigated dread warred within his heart. Rukia's cell, Shishinro, Seraite, Captain Ukitake looked at the slaughter wrought by his third seat and winced. Of the 6 guards, only 2 were still alive, both of whom had multiple broken bones, head trauma, and many internal injuries. Members of 4th Squad were finally able to safely remove the pair from the places where they were embedded into the walls. This act of murder made Rukia's and Ichigo's situation almost untenable. No matter what would happen to her previous charges and conviction, to kill members of the Captain Commander's own squad was not something from which most people could walk away without dire consequences. Not without the backing of a major clan and the laws governing their members. And when you take into account Byakuya's actions so far, such a thing was out of the question. However, those were not the questions which were really bothering the white-haired captain right now. A simple why was torturing him. Why did Rukia kill most of her guards? And how would it affect the madness which had gripped Seraite? Interlude. Gantz's laboratory, Las Noches, Hueco Mundo. A pink-haired scientist was walking around a cylinder which was as tall as the room. It was full with a clear, bubbling liquid in which a purple-haired girl was floating. She had various sensors attached all over her naked body. The man was admiring his handiwork and impatiently waiting for results of his newest experiment. He was fascinated by the powers this woman had. She had given the Sexter a run for his money. More importantly, she was able to use abilities which were not based on Reiatsu, and that was something that had been unthinkable until her appearance. Aizen's pet scientist was giddy at the prospects for new and previously unknown lines of research. He idly wondered when he'll be permitted to dissect the girl and see what truly made her thick. His musings were ended by the shrill beeping of one of his computers. It had finished analyzing the woman's blood and various tissue samples. The Espada went to the workstation and looked at the results. How interesting. There were many tiny microorganisms, her cells, if this was the source of her strange powers. He grinned magically at the thought what he could achieve with this new information. I wonder if it is possible to introduce these beauties into another host. Please read and review.